This is Naked Mormonism.
I pledge my life, all that I may have. I will strive to the utmost of my ability to be what you would want me to be.
It's time for the truth.
And having set our hand to the plow, we will never look back until this work is finished.
Where is the church going?
I have faith that the Constitution will be saved as prophesied by Joseph Smith. But it will not be saved in Washington. It will be saved by enlightened members of this church.
The explicit tag is there for a reason. So if you get offended at what's said, it's not for you. But most importantly,
may you ponder the truths you've heard. May they help you become even better than you were.
Skepticize everything.
Welcome to this special edition clean-cut episode of the Naked Mormonism Podcast, the Serial Mormon History Podcast. Today is Thursday, August 11th, 2016. My name is Bryce Blankenagel, and thank you for joining me. Today's episode is a special clean-cut episode about a notorious, somewhat infamous person in Mormon historical realms. While attending Sunstone Symposium on the 28th of July, I had the amazing opportunity of sitting down and speaking with Mormon historians and scholars in a one-on-one setting. The last episode featured audio clips from Grant Palmer and D. Michael Quinn, H. Michael Marquardt, and a few other fantastic people and some podcasters as well. I mean, Sunstone was just a great setting to meet all of these people that have been so prominent in my own Mormon research for the past 3.5 years now. They were all willing to just sit down and discuss their work or maybe elaborate on their current projects, like in the case of D. Michael Quinn's Mormon Money book that's on the way, hopefully by the end of the year. I mean, it was just this great atmosphere. But there was one more audio clip that I recorded while I was there, and I didn't play it last episode because I believe that one audio clip deserves an episode all in and of itself. It's just that amazing. To give you a bit of an introduction on it, Sandra and Gerald Tanner have spent decades on the forefront of Mormon historical studies. And the body of knowledge and research that they've built is absolutely astounding. And while Gerald passed away nearly 10 years ago, unfortunately, Sandra is still on the forefront of Mormon scholarship and historical studies, and she remains quite active in the community, attending most Sunstone symposiums and whatnot. It's great. So on a personal note, one of the first resources that I began consuming when I first became fixated on Mormon history about 3.5 years ago was a TV show called Heart of the Matter with Sean McCraney. Now, that TV show used to dive heavily into Mormon historical studies and Book of Mormon scholarship. I mean, now the show has kind of just devolved into like preaching and ministry, but the information on the earlier episodes is absolutely invaluable, and most of it was heavily backed by the work that Sandra and Gerald Tanner have done under the umbrella of a company called the Utah Lighthouse Ministries. That's found on utlm.org. That's where I'm going to be taking quite a bit of the information of today's episode from. Also, if you're interested in checking out that TV show that I referenced earlier, the show that really got me, interested in Mormon historical studies, you can find that on HOTM.tv, Heart of the Matter, HOTM.tv. And they have the entire backlog of, 600 something episodes there. So it's a great show, especially the earlier episodes when they go through Mormon history and, Book of Mormon scholarship. That being said, while I was at Sunstone, I had the opportunity to sit with Sandra Tanner and discuss some of her work. And after having this discussion, I actually attended a panel, where she was, presented about the Book of Mormon, how it was possibly plagiarized from the Bible, King James Bible. And there's a lot of parallels that she drew in that presentation. So, Sandra Tanner, like I said, she's very active in Mormon history still. And I have her and her husband, Gerald, to thank so much for my own, interest in Mormon history. I mean, they basically changed the direction of my life with the amount of research they've done. So to get into this discussion here, I was able to snag her for just over half an hour and discuss a topic that's just completely shrouded in mystery for me, and that's Mark Hofmann. Now, I've known some of the highlights of Hofmann for quite some time now, but I've never actually studied him and his story in detail to understand the scope of his work and everything that he did. Luckily for us, Sandra was happy to share her perspective as the events were unfolding with Hofmann in the early to mid-1980s. The discussion that I recorded with her is incredibly informative, and it serves to enlighten us to, who Mark Hofmann really was, as well as some of the underhanded deals that he did. But I feel like there's a much deeper story here that's worth giving a look into. I really want to understand what it was like to be living in the 1980s when the Hofmann bombs were going off and, when people were so confused about what was going on in Mormon history. So the format of today's show will be as follows. First, we'll listen to the audio clip of the discussion about Mark Hofmann with Sandra Tanner and I. Second, we'll discuss everything that we can find from that time to dive further into the information of which Sandra introduces us. And third, we'll look at the implication of Hofmann's work on the larger body of historical studies to see what kind of effect he had on Mormon history as we know it. So first off, like I said, let's listen to the audio that was recorded between Sandra and myself while we were attending Sunstone Symposium on the 29th of July. She'll introduce us to the topic of Mark Hofmann and give us kind of an overview of who he was and what he did, which we'll just use as a jumping off point to further our own research. Without further ado, this is my interview with Sandra Tanner. Okay, I'm sitting here with Sandra Tanner of Utah Lighthouse Ministries, one of the first people responsible for getting me interested in Mormon history in general. So at the very onset, I want to thank you so much, Sandra, and thank you for sitting down to talk with me for a few minutes here.
Right. Very good.
So I actually wanted to talk to you about something very specific. Of course, you've been studying Mormon history for a long, long time, and you've created this massive body of work that it would take any one person years to chew through everything that you've done. But what I'm most interested in and discussing with you is Mark Hofmann.
Yeah.
Because you and Gerald, your husband, were kind of at the pinnacle of when the Hofmann forgeries were really coming out, when he was starting to make a name for himself in Mormon history. Can you just give the listeners of this show, somebody that doesn't know anything about Mark Hofmann, kind of like a couple-minute rundown of what happened with him?
Okay, Mark Hofmann was a young man in the, late 70s, early 80s, that had evidently come to personally disbelieve Mormon claims, but had not gone public with his family. He went on a mission to England and collected a bunch of books from used bookstores that he sent home to sell to used bookstores. This kind of got him into the book trade. So he kind of developed a little business sort of thing. Well,
and a little bit of a habit, almost an addiction to old first edition books too, right?
Yes, right.
That's kind of a problem later on.
Yeah, so he this was kind of a sideline hobby or whatever, a way of generating some funds while he's on this mission, is collecting these old books. Anyways, he evidently lost his faith while he's on his, or before or while he's on his mission. He had a very devout Mormon family. When he came back from his mission, he was going up, I believe it's to Weber State, and he came and got our big Mormonism Shadow or Reality book.
Mm-hmm. Fantastic book.
And read through that, and that told him all kind of problem areas of Mormon history. And I don't know how much that fueled his later career, but he did get a copy early on. And Mark had lost his testimony, but his parents were devout. I think he had resentments about being forced to go on a mission and the whole Mormon lifestyle and being what he felt was lied to and all these things, that he comes up with this idea of sort of doing his own sting on the Mormon Church. How do you get back at them for what they did to your life?
That's a fair question. Question.
He formulates this idea, and we aren't sure just how much time he spent formulating the plan, but it looks like the plan was that he was going to invent some documents supposedly penned by Martin Harris, one of the witnesses to the Book of Mormon. And initially, they weren't all critical of Mormonism. They would have been some faith-promoting things, because he's trying to build a reputation up as a document dealer and getting rapport with the Mormon Church. But he's trying to establish the handwriting of Martin Harris.
Interesting.
By getting these different documents authenticated in the church, buying them, and that, he's establishing what Martin Harris' handwriting is.
Wow, that is very, very offensive to intellectual studies, right?
Because the end goal, evidently, is, when he gets his document stuff all going, is to eventually produce the 116 pages. Or maybe not all of it, but some pages of it or something.
Okay, yeah.
And Harris was supposed to be a scribe for some parts of it.
Well, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems like in one of his first points where he kind of laid claim to, wheeling and dealing in documents was he came up with the so-called Anthon transcript, right?
Oh, earlier than that, he had things going.
Oh, really? Okay.
Oh, yeah. Early on, he came to us with a paper that was supposed to be the second anointing prayer. And
wow. Okay.
He brought it in to me at the time. I didn't know who he was, but he brought it in to me and said he was going through his grandpa's paper after his grandpa died, and his grandpa was supposedly a worker in the Salt Lake Temple, and in his grandpa's paper was this prayer for the second anointing blessing.
Wow.
And he wasn't trying to sell it to me because he knew I didn't have any money, but he's trying to get things authenticated to see how it floats. We'll put it out there to some different people out here and see if they think this looks authentic, Wow. So,
and let's just say, he was smart about doing this. I looked at a picture of the Anthon, supposed Anthon transcript that he had. He had taken characters from the character's manuscript, and he had just followed the guidelines that Anthon had said in his letter, and made basically his own
different columns.
Yeah.
So Mark starts off with some very small forgeries, to try to gently ease into the market with some innocuous stuff or sensational stuff.
Oh, right.
And so the second anointing paper he ends up selling to Utah State University Special Collections. Jeff, whatever his name is, I can't remember now, the guy that was at the time the curator, he wasn't sure if it was authentic or not, but he bought it from Mark. And so he's building up his name for fame, that he can find documents. And so then you start getting these rumors of different documents. Oh, this document or that document might be out there,
Right.
Yeah, someone said that they saw it, and, so then this story starts going around about this salamander letter.
The white salamander letter.
Yes, there's this letter that Martin Harris writes
to William Wines Phelps, right?
Yeah. So, and it's talking about the this toad creature that jumps out of the hole when Joseph gets the plate, the white salamander. So it becomes an account of the plates set more in a magic tone than the standard story.
Well, and let's just say, the specific of a white salamander, that was something that was unique to Mark Hofmann, from what I understand. But the idea of it being like a toad or something, that seems like that was from
E.D. Howe's book.
Yeah. And the affidavit of William Chase or something, right?
Right.
Okay, so there was foundation, there was historical foundation, just not specifically for the salamander itself, right?
I think this is what Mark did with most of his documents. He knew of some incident or document that wasn't around today that he could fabricate a document for and get a market for it because it fit in the whole historic context.
Exactly.
And so, like, a lot of Mormons thought of Mark as trying to change church history. He wasn't trying to change it.
He was just trying to make the documents exist for the narrative that was already in place.
Yeah, he was trying to force the church to admit how it really happened.
Exactly.
He believed the early history told right would involve magic.
Right.
And so he comes up with this document by Martin Harris that kind of hints at magic stuff, so that the church will want to buy it and get it off the street. And
and that was the best part about it too, is he would sell it to the church sometimes for $25,000, some exorbitant amount. You know, Gordon B. Hinckley was the acting president at the time, and then it would get out.
Yeah.
He would sell it under wraps, and he'd say nobody would know about this, and then it would get out to the press that the church bought this document. Exactly. He was so smart. He's playing both sides that way. I mean, it was devious.
See, but this all ties back into the handwriting thing, because he had done some earlier stuff. Then now Martin Harris' signature, writing and all, has something to be checked against.
Exactly.
So he's providing his own documentary trail of Martin Harris documents to authenticate his forgeries.
He was playing the long game, no doubt about it. I mean, he was establishing himself. Who knows what the actual end game for him was?
Yeah,
right.
Well, I think it was for the 116 pages. That'd be worth a lot of money if you had 116 pages that had something strange in it.
Even 30 pages, and the rest of them are tattered and burned.
He doesn't have to get the whole thing. He just has to have a few pages that were from that looked strange some way.
And looked like Martin Harris' handwriting.
Martin Harris' handwriting and church.
And sounded like the Book of Mormon, sounded like the first, second Nephi. Yeah.
Right. So he was very clever in all of that. So when we first started hearing hints of the Martin Harris letter, Gerald gets all excited. He thinks, oh, wow, wouldn't this be great? We get this man. This is going to be super. So because of that, he starts studying up on Martin Harris. And so he's reading again the E.D. Howe affidavits and all the different things surrounding Martin Harris to get ready for when he finally gets the document, he will have done his homework to where he can look at it and see if it's really authentic or not.
As an expert, he became an expert on it. So
he's looking into all this Martin stuff. So he kept telling different people, I got to see the text of this.
Right.
I've got to see how it's actually worded, because he had some reservations about whether this sounds too good to be true kind of problem.
Right.
And so he says, I got to see the text. Well, we finally get the text of the salamander letter, and Gerald's studying it. I don't remember, for a couple of days or something. And he comes into me and he says, it's a fraud.
No kidding.
And I'm like, Gerald, what do you mean it's a fraud?
Because you were you were excited about it too, right?
Well, Dean Jesse, the Mormon Church historian, is accepting it as authentic.
Oh, yeah, that was...
hello, this guy's trained. He's a trained librarian or whatever.
He's a Mormon historian. Yes, exactly. And he is trying to come up with apologetics for it, saying, oh, well, a salamander could have represented an angel in fire. No.
And so Charles says, I'm telling you, Mark made it up.
Wow.
It's like, Gerald, you can't just go. He wanted to immediately publish something. I said, Gerald, you can't go on public accusing this guy of fraud.
Right.
I mean, I have visions of seeing us losing our house in a lawsuit for defamation and,
Well, and Mark Hofmann was beginning to become a powerful and very rich man, too.
Well,
so
everybody's thinking, oh, wow, Mark's the king of the hill when it comes to research on Mormonism, and he's found all these documents and everything. How could you doubt Mark Hoffman? The church all believes it's Mark Hoffman. So, document.
That was part of the problem too, is he would intersperse legitimate documents into his forgeries, or he would wheel and deal in vastly legitimate and first edition books and documents, and then he'd just kind of pepper in his own forgeries, and it was hard to distinguish one from the other, right?
Right. And one of the problems we had for determining these things on Mark, we didn't know all the documents he was claiming to find, because he would go to one document dealer and sell him something. That document dealer then sells it or trades with some other guy for something else. And so someone else eventually brings the document forward to the public, and you don't see, but it came first from Mark Hoffman. So we didn't know how many documents that were coming forward. We didn't realize how many all stem back to Mark was the first time we hear about it.
Right. That's a problem.
Yeah, and there's no provenance for this stuff. They just pop up. Well, Mark went to some old bookstore and he opened some book and he finds the Oath of a Freeman. The earliest printed document in American history.
Yeah, 1639 or whatever. Yeah. Weird.
What are the chances? Well, of course, at the time we didn't realize he found 2 of them.
Oh, really? Well, what's the chances of that? There's only, 30 of them printed at the time?
Yeah.
And, each one would be worth, millions of dollars now. Yeah. He found 2.
Right.
Remarkable.
Yeah, and I don't know how much he talked about that publicly, but there were 2 of them. He was trying to sell one to another guy. One he was trying to sell, I don't remember now if it was the Smithsonian or the Library of Congress, but might have been the Smithsonian. But he was trying to sell a copy to them, which is what led to the murders, is that he was short on cash, and if he could get that $1 million from the agency that was looking at it, it would have helped a lot of his finances, and they were delaying buying it. And so, anyways, that's
because they were kind of starting to question it a little bit too, right?
Well, I mean, it is such a phenomenal find that they weren't going to just immediately stamp it as authentic until they had time to really, really study this.
Well, and he was also dealing signatures of founding fathers and stuff.
Yeah.
I mean, he didn't just stay with Mormonism alone. It was just any historical document that could have fetched a multi-$1,000 price tag.
But we didn't know about a lot of that.
Right.
See, it was all going on behind the scenes with all these collectors. So if we'd have seen the scope of his dealings with these things, we'd have probably had questions sooner.
Oh, yeah.
But we didn't see most of these dealings. But Gerald and I had these conversations when he comes up with this idea, you sure it's a fraud? And we'd sit around and talking about, okay, what are the probabilities that a guy around 25 to 30 could invent this many documents, or that a guy between 25 and 30 would find these many documents.
Right. What's more probable? Or least probable?
Neither one seemed probable.
Wow, right?
Yeah, and so how do you get past that one? We got the documents out here, so which is the answer? Yeah. Well, Gerald, sure it's fraud. So comes along to one of the Sunstones, and I don't remember which one it would have been in the
early 80s,
early
right?
80s.
Yeah.
Gerald did up a paper on parallels to the E.D. Howe book, affidavits, to the Salamander letter. And he also talked about the Joseph Knight article that had been in the BYU studies. And I don't remember the name of the article, but it was talking about some writings of Joseph Knight, who would have been back on the scene with the Smiths in New York.
Yeah.
And so Gerald put out what he felt was an argument of why the document can't be authentic.
Wow.
And he wanted me to take them up and pass them out at Sunstone to the people that were all involved in Mormon history.
And because they had all heard about the Salamander, most of them had read it, and people were familiar with it. Yeah.
They're buying into this.
Well, and that's just the vast majority. You guys were on the forefront of spearheading the investigation. Everybody else bought into it.
Right.
And I have to say that speaks loads to your intellectual honesty, because you have been labeled anti-Mormon research agency since you guys found it, basically.
Right.
And the fact that you were taking this document and saying, this is a document that's very damning to Mormon history and to the truth claims of Mormonism, I think it's a forgery. I don't think it's authentic. That just shows how intellectually honest you were in this, this research.
Well, yeah. So when we came out against this, a lot of former Mormons were upset that, this is the greatest thing that had come along in a long time. How can you guys be fighting against it? Well, because it's not history. It's not true.
History, yeah.
So I go up to Sunstone, and I'm passing out these little leaflets to everybody. And it caused a little bit of a stir of everybody looking at what Gerald had said, that it can't be authentic. So Monday morning, here comes Mark Hofmann showing up at my door.
Wow.
And he says, "Oh, Sandra, I just can't believe that you guys would put up this paper questioning my document."
Wow.
And he came in and we talked for a long time. And so I just reiterated to him the things that Gerald had said to me, what he found troubling in all of it. And Then we talked some about the provenance, where to come from, how'd you get it, kind of stuff.
Right.
And
that's important.
And there's never any real clear path back to anything authentic.
I found it in the leaves of an old Bible or whatever.
Oh yeah,
you
just bookstore in a book or whatever,
Like how did it get there? What are we talking about here?
So, this is how it goes to Mark's ability to read and play people, because because I'm a descendant of Brigham Young. And Gerald and I had done a lot of writing on Brigham Young era and crazy stuff Brigham Young did. So he's going to appeal to me on that basis.
Wow.
So here's the pitch. He says to me, I've been talking to the Thomas Bullock descendants. And Thomas Bullock was the secretary to Brigham Young.
Okay.
I've been talking to the descendants of Thomas Bullock, and I found this one relative that has his papers, his diaries and notebooks and stuff. And this guy handled Brigham Young's finances. And we have the possibility, if we can get hold of this stuff, we'll have all kind of things on how Brigham Young handled the money of the church. And so he's building this all up to me.
And you're just like salivating, like, oh, yes, sounds great, right?
Yes, but he's saying, if you keep questioning my documents and it makes people pull back from talking with me, I won't be able to get these Bullock documents. So you guys need to back off.
Kind of tipped his hand a little bit there, didn't he?
Yeah, so you guys need to back off so I can get these Bullock papers. This is going to be so important that you won't want to stop this from going down. Okay, so he goes out. A little later, Gerald comes home from wherever he'd been. And I said, oh, Gerald, you missed it. Man, Mark Hofmann came in. And he said, oh, yeah, what do you have to say? And so I'm telling him about Mark's on the verge of this great collection of the Bullock papers. And wow. And so I'm giving Gerald the whole pitch.
Right, of course.
Why we need to lay low on Mark Hofmann, because he's about to get this great find.
At this point, was Gerald kind of like disenchanted with Hoffman a little bit?
Yeah.
Having, this idea that, he's obviously a forger. Right. Was he like, of course, he's just playing you? Was he able to say that?
Oh, it was worse than that. He just has this deadpan look, and he looks at me and he says, yeah, and I got a bridge I want to sell you in Brooklyn. And I says, seriously, Gerald? And he says, the guy's putting you on.
Oh, wow.
I says, well, how can you know that? He says, I'm telling you, the guy's making this stuff up, and that's just a con game he's given you to turn you off from questioning his documents. And I'm like, wow, pop my balloon. And so then he wants to do this big newsletter where he's going to expose Mark. And I'm like, oh, man. Gerald, you're getting into some serious territory of defamation here.
Oh yeah.
And so, we had so
But
many.
It's not defamation if it's exposing a truth.
Right. I says, Gerald, he's going to take us to court.
Yeah, right.
And Gerald says, he's not going to take us to court because he has no documents.
Right. You were calling the bluff.
Yes.
And Gerald knew it, too.
Yeah,
he knew. So he knew that truth was on your side.
Yeah. So Gerald said, yeah, he's not going to take us to court. He doesn't have any documents. He made these up.
That's rich.
Well, so we get to the newsletter. And I said, Gerald, the only way that I'm letting you put that stuff in is if I get to do a counter article. We actually did one newsletter where I respond to him.
Wow, really?
And, yes, well, trying to tell everyone, now, don't be too hasty. There could be answers for his questions, and we're still looking at this, and it may be his document still could be true and all this.
And let me just say, that even more speaks to your intellectual honesty, because you didn't just immediately side with Gerald and say, obviously he's a fraud, let's crucify this guy. Yeah. You said, okay, we have to examine this the best way that we have to be pragmatic about this. We can't just go extreme with it.
Yeah.
I mean,
of course that turned out he was right. And, I was kind of ticked that he was right because I wanted Mark's documents to be true.
Oh, yeah. I think a lot of people did.
Yeah. So it was a really weird time.
Mm-hmm.
And then the bombings happened.
Mm-hmm.
When they happened, we weren't sure at first. We didn't realize that it was Mark.
Wow. Because it was over like a 2-day period from when he...
3, probably.
Okay. It's because he bombed and killed 2 people. And then on the 3rd day, that's when it blew up in the back of his car or something. Right. Okay.
Right. But see, when the first bomb goes off, I thought was some Mormon is upset about all these documents coming out that are critical of the church.
Right.
And so someone's trying to stop investigation into Mormon history and trying to get rid of people that dealt in Mormon history and documents and stuff.
Wow.
And so we thought it was a Mormon that was doing it. Well, the Mormons all thought the anti-Mormons were doing it because...
Wow. Okay. Confusing time.
Yeah. It's a confusing time. And then when the 3rd bomb went off, when Mark had a bomb go off in his own car, the news was kind of reporting that there was some question as to who caused the bomb. And they were sort of like the news people were playing back and forth. Well, he could have been the one that did it himself, or it could be somebody else, could be a business thing, all this kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. And we aren't sure what to make out of this, who was doing it. So I called up the detective's office in Salt Lake.
Wow.
And I says, I know you can't tell me much about your investigation, but can you give me some direction on whether I need police protection?
Right. Because if people that are wheeling and dealing in Mormon documents are getting blown up, and you guys are exposing that, that's a legitimate question.
Right. So how sure are you guys that we don't have anything to worry about?
Right.
And so this detective was very careful on choosing his words, and he said, Mrs. Tanner, all I can tell you is at this point, we are sure that you do not have anything to worry about.
Wow.
And so they knew at that point that it had to be Mark.
It was him.
And the reason they knew that was that when Mark's injuries happened and he gets blown up and he goes to the hospital and he comes to and they're talking with him, what he says doesn't match what happened in the explosion.
Really?
And that made the police right off suspicious of him.
Right.
Because he was saying, I got in my car and I saw this box and I picked it up and then it blew up.
Okay.
The police knew that he had to be kneeling with the driver's door open, one knee on the seat and one leg outside of the car. So he's kneeling and leaning into the car.
Okay.
And he's picking up the box on the floor of the passenger side.
Oh, okay.
And as he picks it up, it's a mercury switch bomb. Mm-hmm. And we don't know if he bumped the control panel or stick shift or, I don't know what kind of car he was driving, but they figure he some way jostled it. And it blew up and it threw him out of the car and it threw him over almost to the other side of the street.
Wow.
It blew off his kneecap and some of his fingers. And
Jeez.
The police said, we knew he was not sitting in his car when that went off. He would have killed it.
Right.
He had to be kneeling in, and that's why he was blown out of the car, because he wasn't really in it. Well, he's telling the police, I got in and sat down in my car, and then I saw the bomb, and they're thinking, no, that's not the way it happened.
Wow.
So that put them right off the bat looking at Mark.
Yeah, of course. But, I mean, being a con man, he wasn't going to stop lying until...
he had this story of some white van that had been following him around and was giving them some sort of big story on this, trying to make it point to something else. Mm-hmm. But then all the news media are coming out here to cover this because, wow, 3 bombs in Salt Lake City. And
that's crazy.
And it some way connects to the Mormon Church and history and these historians, what's going on? So we have all this news media coming out here. And they'd go down to the police and want to talk to them about their investigation, what they were looking at, and everything. And so the detectives would say, we can't tell you anything about our investigation.
Right.
However, if you go down to the Tanners, let me give you their address. I think they got a pretty good handle on what's going on. So you just go down and talk to those guys.
Wow. So that was just a media frenzy for a while.
Oh,
right?
yeah. We were on Good Morning America and Nightline and we were on all sorts of programs at that time because it was Man Bites Dog. It was so unusual wouldn't you guys have been wanting his documents to be authentic?
Yeah, of course.
Well, yes, if they were authentic.
Exactly, yeah. But, I mean, because they did pose problems for the Mormon Church.
Yes.
And as, being labeled as an anti-Mormon ministry, it would make sense that, these challenging documents being authentic is, it helps your narrative, right? Lots of books can be written about the salamander letter being authentic. But if it's all a forgery, then it's kind of not much of a story. Right.
So 3 major paperbacks got written on the salamander story.
Okay. There you go.
And one by a New York Times reporter called Gathering of Saints, I think it was. And then one called Salamander that was done by 2 liberal Mormon historians that used to be involved in Sunstone. And then one that was done by 2 attorneys from New York.
And this is on the Hofmann story
on the
as
whole
a whole.
Hoffman story.
Okay, so not examining the letter, thinking it was legitimate.
No, after the whole thing was finished.
Okay, that makes sense.
Then these 3 major books came out, but all 3 of them talk about Gerald first questioning the documents and our involvement with all this. One thing that's often asked me, and I think you'd asked me about it earlier, was what was my perception of Mark? He was a very intelligent guy, but he was sort of nondescript. He wouldn't have hit you as a genius, creative, or a likely candidate for doing some big scam. But that's why con men can get away with it, is because they don't impress you that way.
Yeah, exactly. Well, and to be doing so much of this at the age of 25 or 30, and I mean, you and Gerald just questioning whether he was even capable of orchestrating such a thing at such a young age, I think that has a lot to do with it too. He was obviously a genius in his own right. He was very intelligent, and he was able to mastermind a huge web of lies until it all collapsed on him.
Right.
So it's just...
He was a good salesman. I mean,
that was a big part of it. Well, and that was what's so remarkable is... I think rough estimates, because the numbers aren't actually out there, but I think the rough estimates are he wheeled and dealed somewhere like $900,000 worth of documents, and the value of those documents in trading and selling between the church and himself.
Yeah.
And most of that was done with Gordon B. Hinckley as the acting president of the church too. The prophet that I grew up under. So I mean, this stuff is all recent history. This is all very recent stuff.
Well, and his document business was successful in that all of the stuff he traded in was not forgeries. He would trade with people. And so you say you were a collector, he'd come to you and say, I've got, say, a Martin Harris document. I'll
letter
trade
to his
you.
Wife or whatever.
Yeah. I'll trade you for, what do you have? Oh, well, I've got a couple of these signatures or that, or I've got a Joseph Smith signature or something. And you negotiate a trade.
Or a Kirtland Bank note.
Or something that way. And so you make a trade. And so then he would turn around and sell that authentic thing to somebody. So not all of his transactions were forged documents. Some were genuine things that he would get in trades. And so that made it look like... that made it look like he was dealing with authentic documents, because some were.
Well, and that was the biggest problem with it too, is when he was able to, kind of mask what he was doing with legitimate documents, it kind of throws a whole wrench into exposing everything that he did as fraudulent, because
a lot of what he did wasn't. A lot of it was legitimate. So that makes it even harder. I wanted to ask you, correct me if I'm wrong, but did you have access to interview him in prison?
No, he will not do an interview with anyone.
Really?
No, this is why you have the book on the Laffertys.
Okay.
Under the Banner in Heaven.
Oh, okay.
The reason that book is done is because that guy originally wanted to do a book on Hofmann. And Hofmann wouldn't give an interview, but Hofmann shares a cell, or did at the time, with Lafferty. Can you think of the irony of that? Lafferty and Hofmann in the same cell?
Wow. Amazing.
And so I guess Mark must have talked to Lafferty about this famous author wanting to do a book on him, and he says, no, I'm not going to give him the time of day. And so Lafferty says, well, I talked to him. Tell him I'll talk to him. And so then Krakauer says, oh, okay, I'll hear your story, and then does the book on the Laffertys, which I'm glad it was done because it's an interesting book. Mm-hmm. But that's how it came about, was that because Mark would not give an interview, he still will not give an interview to anyone.
Wow.
I mean, his kids can go see him, but
of course, but
his kids and his lawyer is all I know.
And I'm sure a lot of people have been trying to crash that shell for a long, long time, too. I mean, just knowing who he is, knowing the history of what he has done, it makes him such a fascinating individual. Yeah. I mean, criminal mind are very fascinating to so many people that want to write books about him. It's a shame that he won't interview, though.
Right. Well, and I feel bad for his wife and kids, but, well, this is true of anyone that commits murder. The family ends up with this horrible burden that disrupts their lives as well.
Yeah, no doubt.
But Dory, Mark's wife, it surprises me, or maybe it shouldn't surprise me, that she would not be curious to know what he was doing in the basement. Mm-hmm. And he evidently told her and the kids they were never to come in the basement. That was his research in his books. And they're all valuable stuff. And, we can't have anything getting dust on it or destroyed or anything. And that she wouldn't still go look.
Yeah, but it was just a big forgery unit. I mean, he had a lot of books down there. I mean, it was his laboratory where he was manufacturing these documents.
Right.
Wow. Remarkable
and
stuff.
Yet, above ground, he's doing the Mormon game, and faithful Mormon wife, all going to Sunday school, and everything is wonderful in the Mormon world, and he goes down to his basement and is concocting forgeries.
That's just remarkable.
Yeah.
Oh, wow. So, the story of Mark Hofmann.
Yes.
There's no end to it. So I don't want to keep you for much longer. Of course, you have a presentation coming up here tomorrow. Is that correct?
Yeah, right.
Can you just tell me, 2 minutes on what that's about?
It's 4 different views of the Book of Mormon. Okay. And so it's the spectrum of, I'm assuming, I don't know, I haven't seen the other people's papers. We each get 15 minutes to present our position. And then have a discussion.
Oh,
and
fantastic.
So the other 3, I'm assuming, are going to give some form or variety of the Book of Mormon as either half ancient document and half Joseph's verbiage, or allegory, or some sort of inspired expansion.
Okay.
Something, because they have to, whatever your position, you have to account for the King James verbiage.
Oh, yes.
In the Book of Mormon.
And also adieu.
Yeah, right. And so anyways, my paper is on why I think the Book of Mormon is plagiarism.
Okay.
And while we know of different books in Joseph's day that he could have been utilizing, I'm going to stick to just 2 sources that we know he would have had readily available to him. Mm-hmm. The other books, you can speculate that it looks like he was looking at View of the Hebrews or the Late War or something.
And I have to say, the listeners didn't listen to this, but you and I, over lunch, we discussed the Spalding theory, and obviously we hold the very different opinions on that. But yes, anyway, please continue.
So, but no one is contesting that he wouldn't have had access to a Bible.
He must have.
Yeah, he had to have a King James Bible. Obviously, the family had a King James Bible. He says in his earliest First Vision account, I studied the Bible from the age of 12.
Yeah.
I believe him.
Simple as that. Yep.
Yeah. So whoever owned it, he had one to study.
He had a Bible.
And there are parallel phrases, not just to the Bible, but to the King James preface to the Bible that's still printed in the front of a Mormon Bible today.
That's fantastic.
And there are words, phrases that parallel to the Book of Mormon in there.
That aren't in the Bible itself, but are
right.
just in the preface.
Right.
Which is awfully interesting to see those in there. Okay.
And the other is the parallel in the Westminster Confession. His mom and sister and brothers had joined the Presbyterian Church. The Westminster Confession is like their Articles of Faith.
Okay.
It's a big document that describes what Presbyterians believe, part of the Reformation. Every Presbyterian minister knows the Westminster Confession, and if they're good Presbyterian, they would have, at the time, known it and studied it as well. It declared what they believe. And so I'm sure that he had access to that.
Yep.
With his
Whether
family.
it was when he was going to church, when his siblings were going to church, maybe he had one in the home. Who knows, right?
Right. So those are the two things I'm using, the Bible and the Westminster Confession.
And you don't even have to go to school textbooks or, posit some claim that, maybe he had access to Ethan Smith's view of the Hebrews. You don't even have to go to those. It's just these two books that he unquestioningly would have had access to. Simple as that.
Right.
And that's a strong case. That's a very strong historical case.
Well, what I'm going for is a recent statement. Well, when the church comes out with the pictures of the stone that he used in his hat to do the translation, and now with Uchtdorf coming out with his little thing where he holds up
the iPhone,
and he says, well, it's not a problem to use the stone in a hat because it's like reading a text message off your iPhone.
Is it now?
And so, but what this does is it ties them to a literal translation.
Yes.
Because God's responsible for every word that comes across that stone.
Yeah. Because it was in the white light that came from the stone.
Right. Joseph isn't translating. Yeah. The Mormon scholars admit the plates weren't on the table.
What's the alternative? That he came up with it, right?
Yeah.
And there's no other alternative that still allows the Book of Mormon to be true in any sense of the word. Right. Simple as that. So that's why I think at this point they're kind of grasping at straws.
Yeah.
It's getting further and further away that they're just grabbing whatever they can. So
right.
And I have to say, I really, really look forward to your presentation, your panel discussion, I guess I should call it, not just a presentation, and more so to the Q&A section after. That's going to be the best part. So awesome. Sandra, thank you so much for sitting down with me. This has been a very enlightening conversation, and you educated me quite a bit on Mark Hofmann, and I hope the listeners have enjoyed it as well. So thank you, Sandra. And be sure to check out all of her work on utlm.org. It's a frequent resource that I use in my research. Just, like I said, years worth of research there. Please check it out. So, thanks.
All right, that was the audio with Sandra. And I mean, like I said, there's just so much there, and things that she said and introduced us to are basically just jumping off points that have spawned all of the research that compiled this episode. So let's dive into part 2 that I talked about here with this episode and really try and understand what happened with Mark Hofmann and everything that he was doing in the 1980s. Now, I have a feeling like this is going to be a lot of information to cover, and I've therefore opted to split this into 2 episodes instead of just making it like one 6-hour long episode or something. So today's episode will introduce us to Mark Hofmann and other relevant individuals surrounding him, while next week's episode will cover the bombings and the historical fallout of his actions. So to get us started, let's introduce our protagonist for this episode, Mr. Mark Hofmann himself. He was born on December 7th, 1954 in Salt Lake City, Utah. At the age of 12, he purchased his first piece of Mormon history, which was a Kirtland Safety Society banknote that was signed by Joseph Smith and Sidney Rigdon. Now, this shows us, this purchase at the age of 12 shows us that from a very early age, Mark was drawn to historical artifacts and old documents, especially when they related to Mormon history. On November 27th, 1973, Hofmann was called to serve a mission to England Southwest Mission, which involved the areas of Portsmouth, Bristol, and Bath. Now, if we're familiar with early Mormon history, that's kind of the area in England where the first missionary troops made their landing and began proselyting in the mid-1830s there. So, this is an important area where there's a lot of Mormon history involved. So while he was on his mission, Hofmann engaged in the hobby of collecting old books and sending them home for use after his mission. Now, when somebody goes into a library here in America and they're looking for an old book, they might find something from, the 1850s or something, something like that old is pretty impressive. But if you go over to England and go to some of the libraries there and look for an old book, you might be able to grab something from the 1500s. So, we're talking a different idea of what's considered an antique book when he was in England on his mission. He had access to a lot more older first edition and rare books than he ever would have had in any libraries or antique shops here in America. After Hofmann arrived home from his mission, he enrolled in the spring 1976 semester of the Utah State University in Logan, Utah. Now, this is where Hofmann kind of enters our timeline as a distinguished individual, right? And where the discussion of Sandra picked up in the previous audio. Around June of 1978, Hofmann went to the UTLM bookstore, that's the Utah Lighthouse Ministries bookstore, that's just south of I-80 on 3rd West in Salt Lake City, in order to attempt to sell Sandra a copy of the Second Anointing. Now, the Second Anointing, for anybody that might not be aware, is a blessing that is given from church leadership to an individual when they have, made themselves very distinguished, or they've made a large contribution to the church, or whatever the case may be. Basically, nothing will remove your Second Anointing, and it's a guarantee that you'll get into the celestial kingdom. Of course, there are caveats with that. But we are going to read that Second Anointing from a photocopy of that plagiarized copy he tried to sell to Sandra Tanner. Now, if you look in the show notes, you can find the link to this. And on the top left corner, it says Salt Lake Temple. And there's some scrawlings up in the top that have been erased, but it said basically burn after reading this. So it was something that was supposed to be it was never supposed to get out there. But it was really just a forgery that Hofmann had done. It was one of his very earliest forgeries that he did in 1978. And what it says is, this is the Second Anointing letter here, supposedly. Dear Brother Blank. It doesn't say exactly who it's to. It's all blanked out. Having the authority of God, I pour this holy anointing oil upon your head and anoint you a king and a priest unto the Most High God to rule and reign in the house of Israel forever. I bestow upon you all of the rights, blessings, and authorities appertaining unto the holy priesthood for the building up of the kingdom of God on earth. By virtue of this anointing, I seal you up unto eternal life, wherein nothing but the unpardonable sin of shedding innocent blood or consenting thereto by denying the Holy Spirit may deprive you of this promise and blessing. Thou shalt be exalted in the celestial kingdom of God, and shalt dwell with the patriarchal family of God forever. With this exaltation I ordain you an equal in the order of the everlasting priesthood, with the gods and all the holy angels upon your fellows. Your kingdoms and power and glory shall have no end. Your righteous seed shall be from everlasting to everlasting, and shall continually sing praises unto your worlds without end. All of this I lawfully do by right of the holy priesthood, in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Ghost. Amen. Now, what stands out about this is there's no names on it. It's not written to anybody. It says, Dear Brother, and then it's a blank space, not saying who it's to. There's no signature from who it's from. It's just a letter that says, basically, this was from the Salt Lake Temple, and this was a second anointing blessing given to somebody. So there are a few things that make it seem not quite so legitimate. However, it is known to be a very hidden ritual, a part of Mormonism that people don't really talk about, is the second anointing practice. So that's something we'll have to dive into in a different episode. But that was the very first forgery that we know of that Hofmann created and that he was trying to sell to people. So honestly, I think it was Hofmann's plan to have the Utah Lighthouse Ministries publish this second anointing document in their own work, and that would establish Hofmann's legitimacy, right? Of course, Sandra and Gerald Tanner refused to print it because they didn't have the pedigree of the document. They didn't know where it came from. They didn't know who had it before this person that was standing in front of them. They don't even know the name of the guy that came in holding the photocopy. They didn't even know who Mark Hofmann was at this time. So they were skeptical of the entire situation and of Hofmann as early as 1978 with this second anointing ritual that he had. So Hofmann left a copy of this second anointing document with the Tanners, and, I think this kind of shows that he wasn't in it for the money at this time, right? But he was trying to establish himself as a legitimate historical document dealer, especially in Mormon historical realms. And at this time in 1978, according to Sandra in the previous audio, he also picked up a copy of the book Mormonism, Shadow or Reality, which exposes quite a few problems in Mormon history. So there may have been something to Sandra claiming that might have somehow motivated him to do what he did. He came to understand Mormon history from a different perspective than he had been taught his whole life, right? So in April of 1979, almost a year after he first went into the Tanners and showed them the second anointing and bought their book, Hofmann wrote a college essay in the form of a letter to his mother, in which he was very critical of the church's history and how it was discussed and taught among believers. So this kind of shows the cognitive dissonance that was coming up in his mind, or maybe some of the frustrations with the historical narrative as it's claimed today. And we may gain a little bit of insight into Hofmann's mind and why he might have been forging these things. Maybe he was airing out his own frustrations with the church. Now, I have to say, it's a challenge to try and ascertain motives for somebody's actions without asking them directly, right? The thing is, Hofmann refuses to meet with anybody today to discuss his motives or any of his actions in the 70s and 80s. However, I think we can look at this time before he began really engaging in Mormon document forgery to gain some insight as to why he did what he did in the mid-80s. A lot of people are frustrated when they leave the church and they learn the real history, the naked history that I like to call it, right? I think Mark felt this same frustration when he began researching Mormon history for himself. I personally believe that he began to research the history from sources other than the church and found these inconsistencies with how the church reports the evidence, which may have spurred the action on his part. Now, we'll try to analyze the deeper motives later on in the discussion about Hofmann, but just keep in mind, he was a strongly believing member of the church. He was obviously quite intelligent. He went on his mission, and upon returning from his mission, he found out just how convoluted Mormon history really is. That sets the scene. That's the type of personality we're dealing with here. So sometime in October of 1979, Hofmann sold that second anointing document that we read earlier, the one that he gave a photocopy of to Sandra Tanner. He sold it to a man named Jeff Simmons for $60, right? I mean, no huge sum of money, but it was an interesting document and it appeared legitimate to this Simmons guy. So, Hofmann sold the document with the caveat that Simmons couldn't tell anybody where he had acquired the document from. This seemed like kind of a recurring theme when he first got up and running. He would sell somebody something, or he would trade somebody one of his forgeries and say, you can't tell anybody where you got this from because it might expose somebody that was in the church at the time. It was only after Gerald Tanner compared this second anointing to the photocopy that he had years later that it was found out to be one of the Hofmann forgeries. It's really fascinating here. So this seemed to be a recurring theme with Hofmann. He would come up with a document, whether it was a letter or a signature or some other antique writing of importance, and he wouldn't detail from where he acquired the document. He always seemed to come up with some kind of excuse, like he got it from a trade with another collector, or he found it in the pages of an old book in a secondhand bookstore or something like that. So when it comes to old documents like this, those documents have to have a pedigree to be legitimized, right? They have to have a line of possession. We have to be able to track where that document came from and how it got to our hands today in order for it to be legitimate. I mean, the same thing with old books, same thing with basically any antique. There has to be some paperwork with that document or with that antique that proves that it's legitimate, right? But the vast majority of Hofmann's documents lacked this crucial piece of legitimacy, which only really seemed to surface once his documents started to be questioned, 4.5 years after he sold the second anointing document to Jeff Simmons. We're just barely getting started in the Hofmann timeline here, and it took a while before people started questioning where Hofmann's documents were coming from. It's quite fascinating to see how long it took here. But Hofmann knew that documents like this needed to be substantiated with a line of pedigree, and in his early days of forgery, he tended to pay more attention to that detail. He wouldn't have time to do so later on, but beginning in 1980, we see that he was aware of the need for a document pedigree to determine where it came from, right? So on April 16th, 1980, Hofmann showed his wife a 1688 Bible, a legitimate Bible from 1688 that he'd acquired on his mission to England and he had sent back. He was sure to point out to his wife that there were some pages that were stuck together, which would seem fairly odd because the rest of the pages weren't sticking together, right? So 2 days later, Hofmann took this same 1688 Bible to Jeff Simmons, the guy that he sold the second anointing document to, who was also the Utah State University archivist, and he showed him this Bible as well as the pages that were stuck together. And of course, who knows what happened with the discussion, but they were curious enough and they eventually pulled the pages apart and miraculously discovered an old Mormon document. Now, if we remember all the way back to episode 4 of this show, we discussed a guy named Charles Anthon, who was a Bible scholar at the University of Columbia in New York that met with Martin Harris in 1829. So, to bring everybody up to speed on the story in case we don't remember anything about Charles Anthon, in 1829, Martin Harris had reservations about funding the publication of the Book of Mormon, and therefore asked Joseph Smith for a copy of some of the reformed Egyptian hieroglyphics that were on the gold plates. Joseph produced a piece of paper with characters arranged in columns, as well as some kind of little circular sigil on the piece of paper as well. This document is nowhere to be found today. What we do have today is called the Characters Manuscript, but it was copied later by David or John Whitmer, years after that happened. The actual transcript that we know of, the actual Anthon transcript that Martin Harris took to Charles Anthon, it's nowhere in existence that we know of. If we had that actual Anthon transcript, we would have characters that were supposedly written on the gold plates copied by the hand of Joseph Smith into print. But this document appears elusive and it just seems to no longer be extant. That's the problem. So when Martin Harris met with Charles Anthon, Anthon warned Harris that he was being preyed upon by rogues, meaning that Joseph Smith was trying to swindle Martin Harris out of the money, because Anthon couldn't recognize any of the characters as being any language whatsoever. He said that they were Roman and English characters arranged in, upside down and, different ways to make it look unique. The symbols that Joseph Smith wrote down were identifiable as not being Egyptian or Hebrew or, anything to that effect. So that was what was written on the actual Anthon transcript. But needless to say, we don't have it now, and if Hofmann would have found this actual Anthon document stuck in the pages of a Bible, it would be extremely rare and valuable document to determine basically what language Joseph supposedly saw on the gold plates. But when Hofmann and Simmons separated the pages in that old Bible and found the Anthon transcript, it was a remarkable find, and everybody believed it. And this rocketed Hofmann to the peak of Mormon historical fame. Less than a week after they, supposedly found this transcript in the Bible, Dean Jesse, who's the head of the Mormon Historical Department in Salt Lake City, accepted the document as legitimate. He convinced the head of Mormon Historical Department, Hofmann convinced this guy, Dean Jesse, that the document was real. And this marked Hofmann's first big score in the realm of Mormon historical documents. So Hofmann went on in the following months to legitimize the pedigree of this Bible that had the Anthon transcript stuck between the pages. And he did this by going to a woman by the name of Dorothy Dean, who was living in Carthage, Illinois. Now, nobody can know exactly what was said during this discussion between Hofmann and Ms. Dean, but he left this discussion with her with an affidavit signed by her stating that the Bible must have come from her own mother, which somehow linked the Bible back to Joseph Smith or Martin Harris. I mean, the details are kind of fuzzy to me, but basically he was establishing the pedigree and the line of possession for this Bible and creating a believable story of how the Anthon transcript got stuck between the pages of that Bible, right? So Hofmann was attempting to just establish his own credibility of his own documents here, and he knew that he needed to produce some kind of line of possession with the transcript. So that's what he was doing. And once he had this legitimacy, he could basically demand a proper price for this thing. So once Hofmann had this signed affidavit from Ms. Dean, the church considered the Bible valid and the Anthon transcript that was stuck in its pages even more valid, and Hofmann cashed out with this first big find. Up to this point, he'd been manufacturing signatures and, other small documents and trades with collectors, but he had never attempted a forgery this grand. And when he did, successfully, it really paid off. On October 13th of 1980, 6 months after Hofmann and Simmons, quote-unquote, found this Anthon transcript, Hofmann sold it to the church for a $5 gold coin that was minted in 1850, an 1830 first edition of the Book of Mormon, and several specimens of pioneer currency from the early Utah years. For this one little scrap of paper that probably took Hofmann a few hours to forge, the church gave him over $20,000 worth of antiques in trades, which is about $60,000 of today's money. This was the first home run for Hofmann, and it only marked the beginning of what the next 5 years would hold. On January 8th of 1981, 3 months after this huge score, something really amazing happened that would have an impact on Hofmann's timeline later on. And I'm not sure what to understand or like how to take this. It's just remarkable. But on this day, January 8th, 1981, Hofmann was arrested for stealing a bag of sliced almonds from a grocery store in Salt Lake. I mean, he had just pulled in $60,000 worth of antiques from the church. It seems ridiculous that a guy that had just basically made this much money, I mean, it wasn't actual liquid cash at this time, but it was a fair amount of money that he had made, would get arrested for stealing something so petty. And, I'm nowhere near equipped to try and psychoanalyze such a fascinating mind. But the reason this matters is because it established a criminal record for Hofmann, meaning that the police department took his fingerprints and attached them to his name and record. So that's important in our timeline. We need to keep that in mind. So whatever happened after this arrest is kind of fuzzy, but he must have paid the fine or done whatever necessary, because the next entry that we have in Hofmann's chronology is important to his next historical document, find. Now, every time I use the word find, it should be thrown in quotes, because that's what he would do. He would so-called find these documents, and then, they were just forgeries that he had created. And then he would say, hey, do you want to buy it? I found this amazing document. So anytime that I say find in the spirit of talking about Hofmann's forgeries, that's what I mean. He found it in the sense of, he just sort of made it up. But his next big historical find happened just, 1 month after he was arrested for this little bag of almonds incident. So 1 month after, Hofmann called H. Michael Marquardt, and that's the same Marquardt that sat down with me to discuss Martin Harris at the Symposium wrap-up episode. That was last episode. So Hofmann actually sought to inquire of Joseph's whereabouts on January 17th, 1844, which was 5 months before Joseph's death in Carthage. 2 days later, Michael Marquardt called Hofmann back and told him that Joseph Smith was at home for a few days in the middle of January. Now, 2 days after Marquardt gave that information to Hofmann, Hofmann approached a church archivist named Donald Schmidt. Now, Donald Schmidt, that's not the last time we'll see this name. Keep Donald Schmidt in mind. And he approached him with a photocopy of a faded 1844 document from that time in mid-January, which appeared to be the text of a blessing Joseph gave to his son, Joseph Smith III. This is the text of that 1844 blessing that Hofmann found. There's that word again, found, that Joseph Smith supposedly gave to his son, Joseph Smith III. The contents of this document are extremely important given what happened after Joseph Smith's death. There's a link for this in the show notes. You can see the actual photocopy of this document. It says, quote, "A blessing given to Joseph Smith III by his father Joseph Smith Jr. on January 17th, 1844. Blessed of the Lord is my son Joseph, who is called the third. For the Lord knows the integrity of his heart and loves him because of his faith and righteous desires." Doesn't that just sound exactly like Joseph Smith? It's remarkable. "And for this cause has the Lord raised him up, that the promises made to the fathers might be fulfilled, even that the anointing of the progenitor shall be upon the head of my son and his seed after him, from generation to generation. For he shall be my successor to the presidency of the high priesthood, a seer and a revelator and a prophet unto the church, which appointment belongeth to him by blessing and also by right." That's very important. This is Joseph Smith anointing and setting apart his son, Joseph Smith III, as the rightful successor to the throne. It continues, "Verily, thus saith the Lord, if he abides in me, his days shall be lengthened upon the earth. But if he abides not in me, I, the Lord, will receive him in an instant unto myself. When he is grown, he shall be a strength to his brethren, and a comforter to his mother. Angels will minister unto him, and he shall be waft as on eagle's wings, and be as wise as serpents. Even a multiplicity of blessings shall be his. Amen." End quote. So let's talk about this letter here. We know that once Joseph died in the 1844 Carthage shootout, there was what we call a succession crisis. Nobody knew who was the rightful heir to the throne because many had claimed it without express written documentation of proper succession. That's why David Whitmer claimed to be the right one. James Strang did. Brigham Young did. So many people claimed to be the proper successor to the throne. But this letter that we just read from Joseph Smith to Joseph Smith III marked the RLDS Church to be the one true church because it implies that the Lord ordained Joseph Smith III to be the prophet once his father died in 1844, only 5 months after this blessing was given. The ramifications of this being a real document would turn the Salt Lake City LDS Church on its head because they followed Brigham Young after Joseph's death instead of following Joseph Smith III as the Lord had ordained it to be the rightful heir to the throne, according to this forged letter anyway that Mark Hofmann came up with. So when Hofmann showed this amazing find, quote-unquote find, to the Salt Lake City archivist Donald Schmidt. There's that guy, Donald Schmidt. Schmidt was non-committal. He was probably overwhelmed with the implications of the content. So Hofmann just went to somebody that might be more interested in the letter. 1 week after showing this 1844 letter to Schmidt, Hofmann approached a guy named Richard Howard. Now, Richard Howard was the archivist for the RLDS Church. We have the Salt Lake City LDS archivist, who was Donald Schmidt, and we have the RLDS archivist, which is based out of, I believe, Kirtland, Ohio, named Richard Howard. And the RLDS Church is the church that followed Joseph Smith III after Joseph's death in 1844. It's something that the LDS Church would probably want to suppress, if at all possible. So, given the contents of that letter, it's easy to see that the RLDS Church may have been more interested in the letter than the LDS Church was, because it explicitly called the RLDS Church the correct line of authority, having passed through Joseph Smith III instead of through Brigham Young like the Salt Lake City LDS Church. So a few days after Hofmann showed this 1844 letter to Howard, this is the RLDS guy, Howard called Hofmann and asked him not to sell the letter to anybody until the 8th of March, an agreement to which Hofmann reportedly submitted. After this agreement was made, however, Schmid, the Salt Lake City LDS archivist, called Hofmann back and agreed to buy the document on the 2nd of March. So, basically, what happened is, this isn't the first or the last time that Hofmann would do something like this. But basically, Hofmann presented this document to the LDS archivist, and he said, "Are you interested in it?" That was Schmidt, and Schmidt said, "No, I'm not. I'm just not sure what to think of it." So then he went to Howard, who was the archivist for the RLDS Church, and said, "Hey, Howard, are you interested in it?" And Howard was probably a little bit non-committal and reserved as well. So Howard just said, "Don't sell it until the 8th of March. He was probably waiting to talk to somebody about it, but from, at that time. So then Hofmann goes back home, and the Salt Lake City LDS archivist, Schmid, calls Hofmann back and says, "Okay, I'll buy it from you," which was a week before Hofmann said that he wouldn't sell it to Howard. So he had the LDS Church and the RLDS Church competing with each other as to who wanted to buy this document that determined once and for all who the true church was after Joseph Smith's death. I mean, really, it's ingenious. It's amazing. He was creating a commodity system and increasing the value of that commodity based on demand. He was creating competing demand between the LDS and the RLDS Church. And he was doing it behind closed doors. Neither the LDS nor the RLDS Church knew that the other one was involved in the deal. So like I said, that's not the first or the last time that this would happen. He was very smart and devious in what he did. So on March 2nd, 1981, the LDS Church purchased this Joseph Smith letter from Hofmann for another $20,000. I mean, that's $60,000 of today's money. It's remarkable. This purchase was authorized by Gordon B. Hinckley, who was first counselor to Spencer W. Kimball at the time, whose health was waning in the early 1980s. And I just have to say, Gordon B. Hinckley is the prophet that I grew up under. He was prophet until I think like 2006 or something. So, I have to say this is recent history, and I really wonder what the atmosphere was like during this time, right? There's no way of knowing what was discussed behind closed doors as these documents were surfacing, right? But after the Salt Lake City LDS Church purchased this letter from Hofmann, they traded it to the RLDS Church 2 weeks later and received an original 1833 Book of Commandments in return. Now, we'll talk about that in a second, but there must have been some reservations about the little back and forth that was happening here, because very soon after this, Hofmann donated an 1865 letter from Thomas Bullock to Brigham Young. That was a legitimate document. It wasn't a forgery, and it was possibly, in my opinion, it was possibly a sign of goodwill, or to possibly remove some circulating doubts about the documents he seemed to be miraculously finding so frequently, right? And this is what Hofmann did. He would occasionally make forgeries and sell them, and he would intersperse legitimate historical documents that he had the pedigrees for, that he had bought from other collectors before. So he was very calculating in how he did these deals here. So a couple of weeks after this little Joseph Smith III blessing went down with Hofmann and the LDS Church and the RLDS Church. The church in Salt Lake held its semi-annual general conference at the April of 1981 conference, during which Gordon B. Hinckley addressed the existence of this Hofmann forged 1844 letter. Luckily for us, the talk is 16 minutes long and the whole thing is up on YouTube. I'm going to play an excerpt from the beginning as well as the last minute of it and leave a link for it in the show notes. Now, I have to put this out there. This is the property of intellectual reserves, and it is being used only for critique and educational purposes. It falls under the fair use clause of Creative Commons licensing, and there is a link to this Gordon B. Hinckley talk in the show notes, and I strongly recommend people check it out so they can really understand what it is.
I think I should like to say a few words this afternoon about the recently discovered transcript of a blessing, reported to have been given January 17, 1844 by Joseph Smith to his 11-year-old son. This has received much attention in the media of late. The document is evidently in the handwriting of Thomas Bullock, who served as clerk to the prophet. Our historical department secured it in pursuit of their practice of obtaining artifacts of many kinds related to our early history. We determined that we would give full publicity to the discovery, even though we were confident that critics, knowing little of the factual history of the church, would seize upon it as suggesting a flaw in our line of authority. Furthermore, and this is of significant importance, we recognize the wording of the document as a father's blessing, having great sentimental value for the reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, whose presidents have been lineal descendants of Joseph Smith. The first presidency and the Council of the 12 determined to offer it to the reorganized church. Officers of that church responded with appreciation, but indicated they would accept the document only by giving us in return another valuable artifact. An exchange was made on March 19th last. I do not wish to open old discussions, but for those who may feel that the document casts a cloud on the principle of transfer of authority through the Council of the 12 Apostles, I desire to review briefly a few facts concerning the document and the history of the period to which it is related, and then conclude with some observations that arise out of the circumstances.
So, given what Hinckley just said, it seems like the presidency and the leadership of the church knew that they just couldn't keep this under wraps. The existence of this letter was circulating throughout newspapers and historian circles everywhere, and they couldn't just let it fly, right? They had to jump onto damage control. The rest of the video that I didn't play, it was basically Hinckley arguing how the language in the blessing says nothing about Joseph III being successor to the throne, but is merely a father's blessing to his son. The final point that Hinckley makes is that Bullock, who was the clerk that wrote the blessing supposedly, as Joseph was giving it in 1844, continued to follow Brigham Young out to Utah after Joseph's death. And Bullock wouldn't have done that unless he had thought that this letter was, just a blessing, right? If Bullock knew that Joseph Smith III was the rightful heir to the office of prophet, seer, and revelator, he probably would have stuck with the RLDS Church in Ohio. Now, in order to refute this argument that Hinckley describes here, I would merely point to the language of the actual blessing to refute the argument, right? This is the text from the actual blessing, quote, "For he shall be my successor to the presidency of the high priesthood." That's from Joseph Smith to his son Joseph Smith III. "A seer and a revelator and a prophet unto the church, which appointment belongeth to him by blessing and also by right." End quote. That's pretty hard to contend with, but the thing is, Hinckley didn't read the actual language of the blessing during this conference talk. He just referenced it in the abstract and said that it's just a father's blessing. It's not an actual ordination of succession to the throne, right? So anybody that had heard news circulating about this letter that, claims that the RLDS Church is actually the rightful successor to Joseph Smith's throne, any believing Mormons that had heard about this that hadn't actually read the text of it themselves would say, oh, well, Hinckley talked about that in the general conference, and he said that it was just a father's blessing. So they were able to write it off, because an apostle had already addressed the argument. But those people were just operating out of ignorance, and I think Hinckley kind of exploited it at that point. So I'm going to play the last minute of it, and I think that kind of sums it all together really well.
We were glad to see our brethren of the reorganized church get the document which contains a father's blessing given upon the head of a son he loved. It is a precious artifact with great sentimental value for the family of Joseph Smith. It does not seriously raise any question concerning the validity of succession in the presidency through the council of the 12 apostles, as that body was established by the prophet and as it has functioned under the revelations of God. Of this I testify in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.
Now, I would argue that the church was trying for all they were worth to conceal these Hofmann forgeries, and were having very little success in doing it. I mean, people in the media, as well as prominent Mormon historians, were talking about these documents coming out that challenged the church in one way or another, including this document that named Joseph Smith III as Joseph Smith's rightful successor, right? The thing is, Hofmann, who was creating all of these documents out of thin air, basically, knew Mormon history, and he knew how to hit them in a way that would hurt the overall historical narrative that the church claimed and continues to claim today, right? Hofmann knew what screws to turn and who to turn them against to put some people in really awkward positions. Kind of like the LDS Church and the RLDS Church bargaining for a single document that challenged the succession narrative as we know it today. Basically saying that Brigham Young has no rightful claim to the throne, saying the LDS Church followed a false prophet, right? So this document was a very tough thing for the LDS Church to deal with. But of course, Hofmann went on later in 1981 to purchase a large collection of letters from a man named Steve Gardner. Now, that's the only time this guy comes up, so don't pay much attention to the name Steve Gardner. But Hofmann bought this huge collection of letters for $20,000, right? And this is a point when Hofmann really started to throw down with the big dogs and began to kind of muck up the historical documents that he was selling, right? He had this huge collection of legitimate historical documents that he could sell or trade interspersed between his forgeries, which just seemed to further legitimize his forgeries. Hofmann could no longer take the time and effort to build up a false pedigree or a line of possession as he had done with the Bible and the Anthon transcript that was stuck in the pages. He was spending too much time buying and selling antiques and old documents to go to the trouble of substantiating his own forgeries that he was cranking out at an alarming rate by this point. It should also be said that Hofmann was becoming quite wealthy at this time. I mean, a lot of his deals involved $20,000, $30,000 at this time. He was really establishing himself as the go-to guy for rare Mormon historical documents. And he was doing all of this before he was even 30 years old. He had a very promising career in Mormon history, and historians that had been in the game for, decades by this time were excited to see what amazing new document he would find next. But there's that elusive word again, find. Whether he found it or forged it, that was the problem, right? Now, going back to the audio earlier that we listened to with the interview with Sandra, I think there was something she said that was very telling here. She said that her and Gerald had discussions about if it were, whether it was more probable that a 25-year-old return missionary was finding these documents or more probable that he was manufacturing these documents. and neither of those conclusions seemed probable, right? He had a lot of people buffaloed and baffled because of what he was able to do. It's clear that he's kind of a genius in his own field, and he was obviously obsessive when it came to his forgeries, right? I mean, the documents he was able to manufacture were of astonishing quality. Not only did his work fool Mormon historians and archivists, but educated people in forensics and handwriting analysis were left with one option of saying, well, we can't prove it that it is legitimate, but there's nothing saying that it isn't legitimate. Which was basically the same as saying that it is legitimate to the layman that wasn't paying attention to what they were saying. Now, somebody saying that we can't prove that it is or is not legitimate isn't the same as saying that it is a real document, right? But people that were writing headlines and newspaper articles that were following Hofmann and the story of Mormon history at the time were much more prone to write headlines of, Mormon historians say salamander letter is probably real or something. That sells copies, right? If they were presented in a more factually accurate line of, something like, Mormon historians and handwriting experts say that the Harris letter doesn't show any prominent signs of being a forgery, but the body of historical documents to reference it against is far too shallow to make a realistic assessment of the legitimacy of the Harris letter. Therefore, judgment should be reserved until proper chemical analyses can be performed to ascertain the age of the ink, and paper can be conducted to verify the age of the document. I nearly fell asleep just reading that, and I'm the one who wrote that headline, right? It's so much more exciting to print a headline of Salamander letter proves Joseph Smith practiced occult treasure digging, right? That sells copies. What I read earlier, that doesn't actually sell copies in newspapers. That's just boring. So here we begin to see a big problem with Hofmann and his work, right? People were excited to jump on his next big find and claim it as legitimate before the proper work had been done to substantiate it as a legitimate document. Now, there are a few metrics that one can use while determining the legitimacy of such a document, right? You can reference the handwriting and the signature against the existing body of verified work, the person has done before. You can compare the content of whatever this document is and see if it shares proper language and sentence structure and everything with what we would expect from a person that wrote it. Or you can chemically and microscopically analyze the document to learn much more from the characteristics of the paper and the ink itself, much less from what's actually written. Now, all three of those tests need to be passed in order for a document to be considered legitimate. The problem was, with the majority of Hofmann's documents, his forgeries, only one or two of those tests were performed, and his work was only marginally passing those criteria. The third part, an in-depth chemical analysis of his work, actually served to be the Achilles heel later on, but it wasn't being performed on his work in the early 1980s, so he was skating by without anybody really checking his work. So to get an idea of the scrutiny his work was coming against, here's a list of organizations and people that examined his work. In April to May of 1981, we have James Debowski and Albert Sommerford, forensic experts associated with the U.S. Postal Inspector's Crime Lab, authenticate Joseph Smith III blessing. So we're talking forensic experts here. The paper tests would be done by McCrone Institute of Chicago, where it was passing tests there. RLDS President Wallace B. Smith announces that a team of experts has tested the Joseph Smith III blessing and established its genuineness. That was in May of 1981. In July of 1982, Hofmann shows Ashworth the letter of Lucy Mack Smith to Mary Pierce, dated January 23, 1929, and they agree to have Dean Jesse, who will come up many times, Dean Jesse, keep that name in mind, to check the handwriting of the letter prior to financial purchase by Ashworth. Selling price is about $33,000 in trade, so he was able to convince Ashworth and Dean Jesse of it here. In November to December of 1982, The Spanish Fork Cooperatives notes sold to Alvin Rust, who was another historian. Hofmann had prepared several sets of undated notes in denominations of 10 cents, 25 cents, and 50 cents, and $1, and he sold various sets to people for $1,500 to $2,500 a set. So he was actually making coins that people were buying. In January of 1983, Hofmann flew to New York City, and there he meets with Charles Hamilton, a well-known autograph dealer. Hofmann convinces Hamilton that the 1825 letter is authentic, and he signs a statement to that effect. So here's another autograph dealer that was well-known in the area that was, wrote off his work as being legitimate. In January of 1983, Hofmann sold a letter from Joseph Smith to Josiah Stowell that was sold to the LDS Church for $15,000, and then the letter was placed in the First Presidency vault. I mean, in March of 1983, the E.B. Grandin printing contract for the printing of the Book of Mormon was sold to the LDS Church for $25,000. In January of 1984, Christensen retains BYU historians Ron and Dean Jesse to study his historical context of Harris' letter. In a January 24th letter to his research team, he counsels them to seek the truth in their studies. I mean, he had all of these people buffaloed. All of these people believed what he was doing. And the best part is, in February of 1984, Dean Jesse and Alvin Rust, both of them being Mormon historians, published books that had Hofmann forgeries in them, claiming them as legitimate Mormon documents. He had everybody fooled. Every single person we just read in that list believed that he was dealing in legitimate documents. His forgeries were passing some serious tests here. The problem with this is Hofmann's web of lies was reaching far and wide, and he was catching more and more victims within his grasp. The issue that this comes into is this web can only hold so much before it gives from the pressure. The Harris letter, also called the Salamander letter, marked the beginning of the end for Hofmann. He did play it smart in the beginning, but I think he became a little bit desperate. We'll discuss this in a minute here, but Hofmann at this time was living an increasingly lavish lifestyle, right? He had an addiction to rare books and documents, an addiction which was only surpassed by his addiction of conning people into buying documents that he was able to manufacture, right? He completed the Salamander letter sometime in November of 1983, and once it was completed, Hofmann invited H. Michael Marquardt to his home to have dinner and discuss the letter. So this is the point where we begin to see a little bit of a turn in the Hofmann story. The Salamander letter, probably one of his most infamous and notorious forgeries of all time. It wasn't the actual one that took him down, but this is where seeds of doubt began to enter the realm of Mormon historians with this Salamander letter. So once Marquardt came over to Hofmann's house, had dinner with him, Marquardt saw the text of this letter, but from what I can tell, he couldn't actually see the paper version of it, just the text. Now, there are a couple of reasons why Hofmann may have invited Marquardt over to his home to look at this, right? He may have been seeking some kind of legitimacy from Marquardt, who was a Martin Harris expert, right? If Marquardt signed off on the Salamander letter, it would have, been an extra vote of confidence that Hofmann would need in order to bring to the table when he was showcasing the actual letter to people, right? It may seem like a remarkable letter, but if an historian the likes of Marquardt signed off on it saying that it was legitimate, it would make the Salamander letter hold much more weight in the realm of Mormon historians, right? Now, another possible reason that comes to mind of why Hofmann brought Marquardt in was, kind of for collaboration, right? Hofmann may have presented the letter as something he was about to acquire, but acted kind of skeptical of it with Marquardt around, right? He might have said, hey, I've heard the existence of this document and I have the text of it, check this out. Tell me what you think. I think it sounds bunk, or I don't think it sounds very legitimate, right? Now, if he was questioning the legitimacy of his own forgery to learn what a critical historian like Marquardt would say, he might have been able to find some chinks in the armor, right? He might have been able to say, oh, well, if it were indeed written by Martin Harris, it might include some of these points that it didn't include, right? But maybe just possibly Hofmann was trying to feel out Marquardt here, right? Marquardt was a Harris expert, and Harris wrote the Salamander letter. Well, that's what Hofmann claimed, right? So maybe Hofmann was just trying to feel out Marquardt's thoughts on the letter to make it seem more legitimate, right? If Hofmann could find out the telling features of a Harris document that would make it seem like a forgery, he might have been able to avoid those tells that would identify the letter as a fraud, right? Making it seem more legitimate to the people that would be studying the letter, because he knew that the implications of the letter, the contents of the Salamander letter, would raise a lot of controversy and a lot of people would be studying it, right? Hofmann may have also wanted Marquardt, as the Harris expert, to be the one to get people riled up about the Salamander letter, right? If Hofmann was always the guy that was telling people about an amazing new document that he found, there's that word again, found, it may seem suspicious after a while if he's just the one guy that all these documents are coming from, right? However, if Marquardt, a respected Mormon historian, was the guy that was getting excited about this letter and spreading word around the Mormon historical realms that this Salamander letter exists, then it disconnects Hofmann one step away from being the person that widely publicized this letter, right? No, really, there's no way of knowing, right? And there are many reasons that come to mind that would explain why Hofmann did what he did in having Marquardt come over to his house to review the Salamander letter, right? There's no way to know for sure his reasoning or motivations behind it, but we do know that Marquardt was the guy who told some prominent Mormon historians about the letter, and he basically gave everybody the Hofmann bug about the Salamander letter. Everybody started talking about it after Marquardt told everybody else. Now, people in relevant fields began wondering what the Salamander letter said and what it could mean for the, church history, given the contents linking Joseph Smith to early 19th century occult practices, because that's what it did. The whole world of Mormon historians and scholars were caught up in rapture about this letter, wondering what would happen when it was finally released. So after Marquardt came over to Hofmann's house to talk about the letter, Hofmann set up another one of his, convoluted deals where he would basically sell the document to two people or organizations and then only deliver to the highest bidder. This was not the first or the last time that this would happen. So, on December 16th, 1983, a man named Lynn Jacobs, who was fronting for Hofmann, Lynn Jacobs and Mark Hofmann were in cahoots together here. So Lynn Jacobs approached the LDS Church fronting for Mark Hofmann, and he said that I have an 1830 Martin Harris letter written to W. Phelps, William Wise Phelps, and that was the White Salamander letter that we're talking about here. When it was presented to them, President Hinckley declined, saying that the price was too high. So that was a little bit frustrating, right? So Brent Ashworth, another Mormon historian at the time, also rejected the offer by Lynn Jacobs. So that was a problem as well. So Hofmann, who was fronting for Jacobs at the time, approached the LDS Church archivist Donald Schmidt. There comes Donald Schmidt again, eventually suggesting that perhaps a wealthy church member could be found to buy it. And then that person would donate the letter to the church, right? This middleman idea proved to be attractive. Basically, why the church would do this is to disconnect themselves from the actual deal, right? If the church continued to buy up so many of these documents and then they were never seen or heard from again, it might start to look suspicious after a while, right? So if the church could have somebody, a third-party person, purchase the document and then donate it to the church, it removes the church from it. So in the light of this middleman idea, a man named Brent Metcalf, who was another Mormon historian that will come up here pretty soon, told Hofmann of a man named Stephen Christensen. Now, Stephen Christensen is a very, very important name. There's only really 4 names that we need to remember prominently throughout this story. We have Mark Hofmann, who was the forger of everything. We have Dean Jesse, who was head of the Mormon Historical Department, who Mark Hofmann had fooled so many times by this point. And then we have Stephen Christensen and a guy named Gary Sheets. Steve Christensen, Gary Sheets. Those two people are very, very important. Keep those two in mind, Christensen and Sheets. So on January 6th, the Harris letter is sold to Steve Christensen and Gary Sheets. They went in together to buy it. So Hofmann had asked for $50,000 for the Salamander letter, but had accepted an offer of $40,000 payable over 18 months with $1,000 down and $9,000 in 2 weeks and the balance in increments of $10,000 at 6-month intervals. There was an actual contract for this. So that was the agreement. Gary Sheets and Stephen Christensen, these two guys went in together and invested in on this Salamander letter and would later donate it to the church. So in late January of 1984, Hofmann tells Christensen and Sheets that he has a cash flow problem. Now, that's indicative right there. He has a cash flow problem. If Christensen would give him the $9,000 plus $5,000 now, Hofmann would give him a bonus, which was a transcript of a November 1st, 1825 contract in which Joseph Smith Sr. and Josiah Stowell and other partners agreed on the divisions of proceeds from a money-digging enterprise they had organized to find buried treasure. Now, if you follow along from, episode like 6 or 7 of this show, you'll know what we're talking about. We have Josiah Stowell, who financed a treasure digging expedition with Joseph Smith Sr., Joseph Smith Jr., multiple people out to Pennsylvania. And this was at the same time that Joseph Smith Jr. met his to-be wife, Emma Hale. So Hofmann claimed that he had this contract, this 1825 contract that was signed by Joseph Smith Sr., Josiah Stowell and other partners, saying that whatever treasure we find from this hunting, this treasure digging, we're going to split evenly. So Christensen says that's just too good. I have to get a hold of that when it happens. But the problem is Hofmann didn't have it in hand. He only had the text of it. So what happened is Christensen and Sheets agreed to advance this extra money that Hofmann needed in exchange for a copy of the text and the right to buy the original for $15,000 if and when Hofmann acquired it. So basically, this is really confusing, right? I'm not 100% sure how to interpret this here. But essentially, Hofmann used a frontman in a way to increase value and drive up the bidding price to basically sell the Salamander letter to multiple people. Now, this is how I'm interpreting it. It could be wrong, but the way I see the plan is Hofmann had the text for the Salamander letter and then was able to manufacture a single forgery. During this discussion with Sandra from earlier, she said that Hofmann would make a deal with somebody that was buying his documents, usually LDS historians, and then he would tell them that he won't talk about the deal or even the existence of the document, and then once the deal was made, or like in the case before that deal was made, in order to drive up the price, Hofmann would leak the deal. He would tell somebody about it, tell the press, tell historians like H. Michael Marquardt about the Salamander letter, or another historian, right? So people would find out about this deal that was going on. He would be doing these deals behind closed doors and tell the people that nobody's going to find out about this, whether they were a Mormon historian or the church's historical department trying to buy up and suppress these documents. Hofmann would make the deal with them and say, don't worry, nobody's going to find out about this. And then Hofmann would go leak the deal. He would tell somebody about it, like Marquardt or another historian or a newspaper or whatever. And then it would become widely publicized, the existence of something like the Salamander letter. And then that would drive up the price, right? Once it was public knowledge that the deal was about to go down for the purchase of these incriminating Mormon documents in order to suppress them, that would drive up the demand and the price for the documents, right? If only one person, if only the LDS Church knows about a document that is challenging or damning to its history, and they buy it and suppress it, nothing happens. They buy it for whatever they can get it for. But if it's leaked out to the public discourse that this deal is about to go down, that the church wants to buy this letter in order to suppress it, suddenly a lot of people want to buy that letter for a lot of money in order to make it so it doesn't become suppressed. So it created this market. It created a false market, basically. It created a commodity system and a market that Hofmann was basically responsible for, right? But the thing is, like, we have to keep this in mind, right? The price for the stuff that Hofmann was dealing, all these Mormon documents that are forgeries, the price for this stuff didn't really have a comparable market. There was no comps to what these investments that people were buying up, right? Hofmann was producing one-of-a-kind documents that the church wanted to buy up as quickly as possible because they were blackmail, basically, right? He was saying that I have this document that shows the church isn't true. How much do you want to buy it for so you can keep it out of the white-hot light of scrutiny? That's a problem, right? But there wasn't like a Kelly Blue Book value on blackmail, right? There wasn't any guide that said that these historical documents that are fatal to the truth claims of the religion are worth X number of dollars, right? Hofmann and the historians that he was buying and selling to and from were the only people that were putting dollar values on any of these documents. And then you have people like Stephen Christensen and Gary Sheets and the LDS Church with really fat checkbooks that come in and basically set out the price for this commodity. Of course, Hofmann, who brought forward all of these one-of-a-kind documents, had his finger on the knob in determining the size of the market for all of these one-of-a-kind documents, right? If he created demand by spreading the word among many interested individuals or groups, he could basically ask whatever price he wanted. So that's why he did these convoluted business deals, right? Now, take, for example, right, what we discussed earlier. Let's look at the trade that was worked out between the LDS Church and the RLDS Church for that Joseph Smith III letter. That's the thing that we listened to the Gordon B. Hinckley conference talk on, right? The LDS Church bought the letter from Hofmann and traded it to the RLDS Church for an original 1833 Book of Commandments. Now, if you don't know Mormon history very well or you don't follow these things, that might not mean anything. But right now, those are so rare, so valuable. Those 1833 books of commandments are so rare that there aren't any on the market right now. There was an extremely limited original print volume. Now, to put some kind of relative value on it, or to try and understand what an 1833 Book of Commandments might be worth, an original 1830 Book of Mormon had 5,000 copies. There were 5,000 original 1830 copies of the Book of Mormon printed. And today, those are going from anywhere from $60,000 to like $120,000 online, right? You can get an actual first edition 1830 Book of Mormon for, $60,000, $70,000, $80,000 right now. A first edition Book of Commandments is exponentially more valuable than any original Book of Mormon because less than 100 original copies were printed before the Independence Printing Press was destroyed in 1830. The Books of Commandments have an absolutely indeterminable value right now because they are that rare in Mormon historical circles. Something that there are none of on the market doesn't have a value, right? If one goes to auction, it might go for as much as a few $1 million right now because they're just so extremely rare. They almost never come up on the market because every single one in existence has been spoken for decades. They haven't been traded for so many years now. As we heard from Gordon B. Hinckley in that audio that we listened to earlier, the LDS Church traded a first edition Book of Commandments that we're talking about here for that Joseph Smith III letter. Hofmann's work was fetching ridiculous prices. Absolutely obscene prices. I mean, he was buying and selling stuff from the church for $20,000 here, $30,000 there, trading 1850 gold coins and, crazy, original Mormon documents and first edition books. He was trading these back and forth, and one forgery, one thing that, took him maybe a couple of hours to make, he was able to basically create an equivalent price as an 1833 Book of Commandments, which is invaluable right now. There's truly no determinable value on it right now. Even back in the 1980s, it was probably worth a few $100,000 at the time. I mean, it's crazy. It's mind blowing to think how much work he had put into these, or how little work he put into these, and how much money he was able to make from them. He was an amazing forger, right? He was able to manufacture these documents and pass them as legitimate across many swaths of historians and autograph experts and chemical analyses. People bought these. People understood that these were real. And he was working in a completely untapped market with zero competitors. He was creating a commodity system based on his own forgeries, and he had a finger on the dial of how much he could ask for those just by the amount of publicity and public knowledge that was available about these documents he was creating. It's ingenious. It's beautiful. It's mind-blowing. It's twisted and wrong and disgusting, and it's offensive to intellectual studies, but he is just so brilliant with what he's doing here. So Hofmann must have had some part in organizing the deal between the LDS Church and the RLDS Church with this Joseph Smith III letter and the first edition Book of Commandments, right? There must have been something there that made those two equivalent in value. But the document that he forged had a relative value that he was able to determine because it was blackmail, right? Hofmann adjusted the market for the Joseph Smith III letter, and he did that by having two different organizations competing for it, right? Well, he did this same market adjustment to increase the value of the Salamander letter when he leaked its existence before selling it to Stephen Christensen and Gary Sheets. Who knows what he was originally asking for it, but once it was publicized that this letter existed, the Salamander letter existed, he was able to make an agreement of $40,000 for this. $40,000 for a piece of paper. That is remarkable, right? But, like I said, he was creating this system. He was creating the commodity. He was creating the supply and the demand for it. He had his fingers on all of the dials. He was basically dictating how much money he was going to get for any given document that he was manufacturing. Now, Hofmann had a front man here. We talked about him earlier, Lynn Jacobs, for the purpose of offering the Salamander letter to Hinckley. Now, when Hinckley thought it was too expensive, Hofmann went to Brent Ashworth trying to get a better price. After both of them denied, the text of the letter was released to Mormon historians, and the press grabbed a hold, making the story viral among Mormon circles. So once this story went viral, people knew about the Salamander letter and some of the text of it. That drove up the price because the church wanted to buy the letter as fast as they could and begin damage control as soon as possible, right? So Hofmann came back to this with a proper solution, and he said, just have a third-party person buy it and donate the letter to the church. And that's where Stephen Christensen and Gary Sheets come in. Then Hofmann struck a deal with Christensen and Sheets to buy this Salamander letter in installments. Now, this is where Hofmann's little cash flow problem began to be come into play, right? When somebody says they have a cash flow problem, that's just code for their living style has outclassed their income, right? So Hofmann needed money. He was getting low. So to solve this new income issue, Hofmann sweetened the deal of the Salamander letter with another forgery that he had yet to manufacture. That was a big problem. This deal sweetener was the contract between Joseph Smith Sr. and Josiah Stowell for their treasure hunting trip in 1825. Now, when Christensen brought in another investor, Gary Sheets, that made it so the deal was done. They were able to put up, the $50,000 basically for this, or, the $55,000 for the 2-pack, the Salamander letter, and this contract between Joseph Smith and Josiah Stowell, right? So what Hofmann did here, and this is where it kind of starts to slip, I think, where control starts to slip away. Hofmann was basically living on credit of Mormon historians and collectors with his own forgeries that he hadn't even produced yet as collateral for that credit, right? He promised these people that he would deliver on a document that he hadn't even made yet in order for them to give him money. Now, I have to say, right, that this doesn't sound like somebody who's in control, right? This doesn't sound like an action that somebody would take if they were in control of the situation. Now, early on, if we go back to, 1979 or 1980, Hofmann actually went to the extra work of trying to substantiate his work and establish a believable pedigree of the document. But by early 1984, he was making deals and taking money on forgeries he hadn't even manufactured yet. In my opinion, and don't take it as fact, it's nothing but a naked Mormon opinion right here, but I think Hofmann was desperate for money. And the facts in front of us seem to make that an easy assumption, right? Just saying that you have a cash flow problem is indicative of a bigger issue, right? Hofmann wasn't able to continue his lifestyle with the work that he was producing, so he made deals he couldn't come through on. Now, pardon me if this may seem a little crass or possibly too simplistic, but doesn't that sound like a crackhead mentality to approach such a fragile business model, right? I mean, any one little mistake could reveal Hofmann and unravel everything that he'd put together, right? He had a very fragile business. He was seemingly desperate enough for money to do anything necessary, and therefore started making some really shaky deals with increasingly epic stakes. He had his mind focused on getting the next paycheck instead of making quality forgeries and covering his tracks, which should have been foremost in his mind instead of the money. I think he became careless out of desperation here. That's the point. The same way that a crackhead may go to very extreme lengths to get their next hit, but not really pay attention to where their next meal is coming from. That's why I mean it's like a crackhead mentality to take here. In March of 1984, his carelessness begins to catch up with him a little bit. In March of 84, Gerald and Sandra Tanner's Utah Lighthouse Ministries, though wanting to believe the Harris letter is authentic, admit to some reservations because of its similarity to an affidavit of Willard Chase in E.D. Howe's Mormonism Unveiled, and to a statement by early LDS convert Joseph Knight. The Tanners publish long extracts from Harris's letter in the Salt Lake Messenger, which is their own proprietary newspaper. Now, on March 7th of 1984, in reaction to this, Stephen Christensen issued a press release admitting ownership of the 1830 Harris letter, because people were wondering who owned it, but nobody, the church wouldn't come out and say it because they wanted to keep it as far from the public eye as possible. But in, middle of March here, Christensen said that I own the copy, but he says that he won't release it until further research is done on it, right? So that's smart. He said, I own it, but I won't actually release photocopies of it until more people examine it. So he employed a couple of researchers here, and they were working on 3 points. The first point was to examine the physical text. They chose a man named Kenneth Rendell of Newton, Massachusetts to do this, who was a historian or a handwriting expert, I believe, at the time. And the second point was to establish the provenance of the letter. Now, for this, Christensen and Sheets employed Dean Jesse, who's the Mormon historian, we said, Dean Jesse, and he worked with a guy named Elwin Doubleday, who was a dealer in postal memorabilia in Alton Bay, New Hampshire. The reason why they did that is because there was postmark on the letter that they had to match up to see if it was proper postage from where it was being sent to, and there were a few things that had to be matched up there. So Dean Jesse, Mormon historian, working with another historian, Elwin Doubleday. And then the third point that they were trying to figure out was understanding the historical context of the letter. Now, this is the most important part because we had a guy named Ron Walker and another guy named Brent Metcalf, and then Dean Jesse, the Mormon historian Dean Jesse, who were all three working together and collaborating on this. Now, what they mean by understanding the historical context of the letter is trying to figure out how to make it fit in the narrative. The problem with the Salamander letter, it was very challenging to believing Mormons. So Ron Walker, Dean Jesse, and Brent Metcalf were collaborating together to say, how can we make this work? How can we say that the Salamander letter is real and still claim that the church was inspired by God and Jesus and not inspired by folk magic and occult practices, and that the gold plates weren't actually found by a seer stone and didn't actually have a white salamander spirit guardian. How can we possibly spin this so it doesn't sound so bad? And that's important, right? Ron Walker, Dean Jesse, Brent Metcalf. Dean Jesse was the historian that was kind of at the forefront of all of this. So with these two dates, beginning and middle of March of 1984, we can see the public reaction to the salamander letter being split, right? The Tanners, in their press release, were apprehensive about the legitimacy of the letter, while Stephen Christensen was working with church historians and other people that were in proper historical realms to try and justify it or try and wrap their minds around the letter. And he said the letter won't be released until 1985, when there are some books that will be written about it. We'll get to that later. But like Sandra had said in her audio clip, Gerald Tanner was hard at work studying Martin Harris and comparing the historical Harris to the quote-unquote Harris that wrote the salamander letter, and he was noticing inconsistencies. Gerald Tanner was at the forefront. He was at the tip of the spear in studying and exposing Mark Hofmann here. Now, Stephen Christensen, in contrast, was working with the church to find the correct way to interpret the letter and wrap it into a narrative that works with Joseph Smith's claims of divine inspiration, right? It was a challenging thing to understand that the prophet Joseph was wrapped up in occult practices. We don't need the salamander letter to draw those connections now, so these historians and apologists had to set the record straight. But, I guess it's not really important because we know that Joseph Smith practiced occult practices back then and rituals and blood sacrifice. But back then, it was much harder for them to wrap their minds around. So historians and apologists were collaborating together to try and set the record straight and tell everybody that the white salamander spirit guardian over the plates isn't contradictory to the narrative of the church that they've claimed since 1842. Now, public outcry was going crazy because the text of the letter had been published. A lot of people were discussing the actual text of it, and it didn't fit very well into the Mormon timeline. It didn't fit very well with a lot of believing Mormons that hadn't studied Joseph's occult practices or read Rough Stone Rolling or anything to that effect. So the Deseret News, which is the church's own newspaper agency, released a couple of articles talking about this. Now, I used to deliver the Deseret News around my neighborhood on a bike at 5 a.m, right? So I know just how popular the newspaper is, and a lot of believing Mormons subscribe to the newspaper. Maybe not so much anymore, but maybe frequent the website. But regardless, the Deseret News is kind of the church's media outlet where they discuss a lot of things that are going on in the church, BYU sports and everything, everything related to that. And the Deseret News kind of became the first outlet for apologetics defending the salamander letter. It's really interesting to see this, right? So there's a September 9th, 1984 Deseret News article in the church section of the newspaper. There's a link to this in the show notes. It's on Google Newspapers, so they have the actual photocopy of it. You have to scroll around near the end of this newspaper to find the church section and find this article. But it discusses the implications of the Martin Harris letter or the salamander letter. It was called by two names. Anytime you hear Martin Harris letter, that's what it means, the salamander letter. I'll try and refer to it as the salamander letter as frequently as possible because that's, that makes a lot more sense. That holds a lot more weight to it. So this is what the Deseret News article said, quote, "The so-called Martin Harris letter is no repudiation of Joseph Smith, but rather probably is a further witness of the prophet's own account of the discovery of the golden plates. This is the feeling of historian Rhett S. James of Logan, Utah, who is the author of the pageant Martin Harris, the Man Who Knew, who just completed its 5-day run at Clarkston, Utah." Now, Clarkston, Utah kind of holds Martin Harris up as a hero, sort of, because when he came back to the church in 18... 1869, I think it was, when he came back to the church, he moved to Clarkston, Utah, and that's where he died, and he was, kind of seen as a Mormon hero. So Clarkston kind of holds this yearly pageant where they talk about Martin Harris, and that's what it is. Martin Harris, the man who knew. So that's what it's referring to. It continues. A recent Los Angeles Times copyrighted story by John Dart said the 1.5-page letter purportedly written by Harris is threatening to alter the idealized portrait of Joseph Smith. According to the Times story, the letter reportedly says that Joseph Smith found the golden plates, which later resulted in the Book of Mormon with the help of a seer stone, a kind of magical looking glass. Now, it's interesting that they would write that in the article here, because we just know that as common knowledge now. Everybody knows that that's the case, but the vast majority of even believing Mormon historians weren't aware of the seer stone. It was not publicized in the 1980s that this was how Joseph Smith translated the Book of Mormon. So seeing something like this in like a Times story or a Deseret News article, it was really remarkable for believing Mormons to read this. He found the Book of Mormon with the help of a seer stone? What are they talking about here? It's hard for us to put our minds there knowing what we know today, but looking back on it, it's really interesting to try and think about how people must have taken this or reacted to these things that were coming out in newspaper articles and, Mormon historical outlets, right? It continues on. It also claims that Smith was prevented at first from gaining possession of the plates by an old spirit that had transfigured itself from a white salamander, Dart writes. The letter, owned by Stephen F. Christensen, Bishop of Centerville, Utah, 13th Ward, was allegedly written by Harris on October 23, 1830 to William Wines Phelps, a newspaper editor and a potential convert. Following Phelps' baptism approximately 6 months later, he became editor of the first newspaper published by the church, the Evening and Morning Star, first published in Independence, Missouri in June 1832. The authenticity of the letter has not yet been established, and Bishop Christensen said the letter will not be released to the public until early 1985, if the letter proves authentic. The letter, if it is proved genuine, will be released when a book on the origins of Mormonism is released early next year, Bishop Christensen told the Deseret News. End quote. That's what we're talking about right there. So Christensen came out and publicly said, I own the letter, but we are not going to release the letter until we're done writing a book that describes the origins of Mormonism. That's what he was doing when he was working with Brent Metcalf, Dean Jesse, and Ronald Walker on the books relating to this. They were trying to figure out how to spin this into the narrative that doesn't come into conflict with the historical narrative as we understand it. They were taking the text of the letter and they were trying to twist it in a way that people could understand it, that people wouldn't leave the church if they found out that Joseph Smith was chased away from the plates by a white salamander. I don't know how they could do it, but I think this next excerpt that we're going to read is kind of telling here. Now what we're about to read is kind of an apologetics runaround that they were trying to get out in the church media. They wanted people to know that the salamander letter wasn't necessarily challenging to their beliefs. So Dallin Oaks, who is still an apostle today, spoke at the CES symposium in 1985. Now, the CES is the Church Educational System. If anybody is familiar with Jeremy Runnels, he wrote the CES letter, which was a letter to a CES director saying, hey, I have, 80 pages worth of problems with the church. Can you answer them? So that's what the CES is, the Church Educational System. They're supposed to be on the forefront of taking care of these problems or discussing these or teaching these problems to the believers. So this is what Dallin Oaks said at a CES symposium in 1985. There's a link for it in the show notes. Quote, another source of differences in the accounts of different witnesses is the different meanings that different persons attach to words. We have a vivid illustration of this in the recent media excitement about the word salamander in a letter Martin Harris is supposed to have sent to William Wines Phelps over 150 years ago. All of the scores of media stories on that subject apparently assume that the author of the letter used the word salamander in the modern sense of a tailed amphibian. One wonders why so many writers neglected to reveal to their readers that there is another meaning of salamander, which may even have been the primary meaning in the context in the 1820s. All right, this is what we're getting here. This is the apologetics that they were trying to offer to defend the salamander in this letter. From Dallin Oaks in 1985. That meaning is a mythical being thought to be able to live in fire. Yes, that's what they were saying. They said people are misinterpreting the word salamander. They don't mean salamander as a tailed amphibian. They mean salamander as a mythical being that can live in fire. What? That's absurd. That is absolutely absurd. I mean, Sandra and I were giggling about that in the interview earlier because it's just so absurd. They can't possibly reconcile these problems, right? But Oakes continues on here. I'm going to finish this up. A being that is able to live in fire is a good approximation of the description Joseph Smith gave of the angel Moroni. The use of the words white salamander and old spirit seem understandable. I guess so. They seem understandable. In view of all of this, and as a matter of intellectual evaluation, why all the excitement in the media and why the apparent hand-wringing among those who profess friendship or membership in the church? Why? Yes, why would people wonder? Why would people question that? That was at the 1985 CES Doctrine and Covenants Symposium, pages 22 through 23. There is a link to that in the show notes. Please read the entire thing. It's remarkable. So that was the apologetic offered. Salamander doesn't mean salamander. It means a spirit that can live in fire. I think it's safe to say that given the absurdity of that statement, the church and its leadership were grasping at straws to try and rationalize the salamander into their own narrative of church history. This was obviously a controversial aspect of Joseph Smith to try and reconcile with the cardboard cutout that is so often constructed by believers in the church. This salamander letter was a very challenging aspect of Mormon history for so many believing members to wrestle with, especially the leadership. To get an idea of what it was like to find out that it was actually a forgery, to kind of like put our minds there, I'm going to read a quote from Ronald Walker. Now, he was one of the BYU professors and historians that was working on a book about the salamander letter that Stephen Christensen was working with, right? This quote was given in August of 1987, very soon after everything with Hofmann had basically come to a close. This is quoting Ronald Walker, quote, "I remember sitting in a sacrament meeting several days after Mark Hofmann had confessed. I felt an overwhelming emotional and spiritual relief. That white salamander that had bedeviled me for so long at last was exorcised. I felt spiritual channels once hindered and partly clogged renew themselves." End quote. So that was what it was like. People that were believing members learned about this white salamander, and it was so hard for them to reconcile their cognitive dissonance. Ronald Walker, he was a BYU professor and a historian who was trying to publish a book reconciling this with the proper Mormon historical narrative, said it was such a relief to have the white salamander exorcised. I think that's probably most telling of all of it, right? It's not like the church was like, oh, we'll be proactive, we got on top of this. No, they were very reactive. They had their back against the wall. Leaders of the church weren't sure how to handle this kind of stuff. And it was the same for just the average believing member that saw the text of the salamander letter in a, somewhere in a book or in a Times article or whatever. I mean, it was a lot to wrestle with mentally. People were twisting their minds into various pretzel shapes to make that salamander still work and still believe in Joseph Smith as their prophet, right? Let's face it. Believing in the Mormon church can be very challenging once a person learns about the real naked history of the church, right? Add on to that already challenging level of cognitive dissonance the Salamander letter, and you have lifelong members who are locked in a downward spiral of wondering if Joseph Smith really had reported the propensity toward the occult and how that affected the golden plates, and in turn how that affected the truth of the Book of Mormon, right? The letter was something that forced a lot of members to confront ugly skeletons in Joseph Smith's closet, and it made a lot of people very uncomfortable with their own level of cognitive dissonance. Luckily for everybody, there were people like Gerald Tanner who wouldn't rest until they found the truth. Now, most of what I'm about to read, and it's quite a bit, but it's important, but most of it is basically how Gerald found the similarities between the Salamander letter and the possible source texts that were used when Hofmann constructed it, right? After that, he talks about the actions that he took after coming to this knowledge. Now, keep in mind, Gerald and Sandra Tanner were and still are, in Sandra's case, at the forefront of so-called anti-Mormon research. The UTLM has been known to spearhead into real Mormon historical research for decades now, constantly bringing up challenging points in Mormon history and drawing connections between Joseph Smith or Masonic and occult practices. The Salamander letter fit perfectly into the narrative that Sandra and Gerald have constructed for Joseph Smith. And had it been real, it would be truly one of the strongest evidences they could use against the church and Joseph Smith. The Tanners wanted nothing more than for this letter to be genuine. As we heard in the conversation with Sandra at the beginning of the episode, she was reluctant to even question Hofmann because she wanted the letter to be real. Sandra was even reluctant to buy that Hofmann was creating these because she wanted the letter to be real so much. Now, this is what Gerald wrote in the book, Tracking the White Salamander. That entire book can be found on utlm.org. You can read the entire thing and the whole content of it on utlm.org. And I'm going to read quite a few excerpts from it and leave links for it in the show notes so we can really understand what it was like for Gerald to be doing this research on Martin Harris at a critical time in Mormon history. Now, keep in mind, also, the Tanners are biblical scholars, and they've been tracking source texts for the Book of Mormon for decades, and they had been before this. They have read and compared hundreds of books to the Book of Mormon that sound similar to it, and drawing comparisons and showing typical signs that imply forgery that are rife throughout the Book of Mormon. Studying words on paper is about the only thing that Sandra and Gerald have been doing for decades prior to the Salamander letter coming out in 1984. And this is written from Gerald's first-person perspective. Quote, "Fortunately, I was able to obtain some revealing extracts from the letter and was preparing to print them in the March 1984 issue of The Messenger. I was very excited that we at Utah Lighthouse Ministry would be the first to break this important story to the world. While in the midst of compiling evidence to support the authenticity of the Salamander letter, I made a discovery that shook me to the very core. I found that the account of the transformation of the white salamander into the spirit was remarkably similar to a statement E.D. Howe published in Mormonism Unveiled. This book, written 4 years after the date which appears in the Harris letter, told of a toad which immediately transformed itself into a spirit and struck Joseph Smith. Even more disconcerting, however, was the fact that other remarkable parallels to the Salamander letter were found just 2 or 3 pages from the account of the transformation of the toad into a spirit. You can go on to actual the utlm.org, follow the links in the show notes, and you can see this comparison. But basically what Gerald is saying is he found extracts out of a book called Mormonism Unveiled, which was the first official anti-Mormon book, basically, published in 1834. He found extracts from that were very similar to passages that were in the Salamander letter, passages that were written by William Wines Phelps. But then he turned the page a couple of pages later, and he saw other passages that were written by E.D. Howe himself that were similar in ways that should not have been in the Salamander letter. Information that could not possibly have been in the Salamander letter, and phrasing and words that were there should not have been. And it was very telling. So I'm going to continue on here. Some years before I had encountered similar evidence of plagiarism in Joseph Smith's History of the Church, the Mormon church leaders had always proclaimed that this history was actually written by Joseph Smith himself. My research, however, led me to the conclusion that the largest portion of it had been compiled after his death. I found that later Mormon historians had taken portions of newspapers and diaries written by other people and changed them to the first person so that readers would believe that they were authored by Joseph Smith himself. In agreement with my conclusions, Mormon scholars later admitted that over 60% of the history of the church was compiled after Smith's death. See Mormonism, Shadow or Reality, page 127 through 135. Basically what Gerald's saying there is he had found where the record in the history of the church had been altered, and he found similar themes, like similar alterations in the Salamander letter that he found with Joseph's History of the Church. And he said, wow, these seem like they have been altered, or like something had been adjusted, or these are plagiarized from another source. So I think that's really important to point out the way that Gerald was able to identify that the Salamander letter was a forgery was by noticing that so much of the history of the church had been forged after Smith's death and changed to be first-person perspective. Really fascinating stuff, isn't it? Anyway, I'm going to continue on here. In any case, parallels I had discovered between the Salamander letter and Mormonism Unveiled reminded me very much of the work I had done on Joseph Smith's history. Although what I discovered about the Salamander letter was not conclusive proof that it was a forgery, it was certainly suspicious. It seemed, in fact, to throw a real monkey wrench into all my plans concerning the publication of the letter, since I knew that it was very unlikely that anyone else would spot these parallels and realize their significance. There was some temptation to keep the matter to myself. I knew, however, that God knew what I had seen, and I began to feel that he had shown me these unpleasant facts to warn me against endorsing the letter. Furthermore, I knew that I would never be satisfied if my case against Mormonism was based on fraudulent material. It was clear, therefore, that there was only one course of action which I could follow, i.e., print the whole truth in the Messenger in the March 1984 issue. Therefore, we raised the question of forgery by printing the title, Is It Authentic? So basically, Gerald was saying that once he found the possibilities of it being a forgery, he wanted nothing more than just to ignore it and say, nobody else will recognize it, and then we can just continue to print on this and say how crazy it is. But he knew that it was a forgery, and he couldn't just ignore it, and he couldn't, build his case against Mormonism based on fraudulent material. That is intellectual honesty at its finest. That is absolutely beautiful. But then he prints this Is It Authentic article in the 1984 March issue of the Messenger, and this is a couple of extracts from it here, and these are really important because he describes the problems with the Salamander letter and how he was able to discover that it was a forgery. Quote, at the outset, we should state that we have some reservations concerning the authenticity of the letter, and at the present time we are not prepared to say that it was actually penned by Martin Harris. The serious implications of this whole matter, however, cry out for discussion. If the letter is authentic, it is one of the greatest evidences against the divine origin of the Book of Mormon. If, on the other hand, it is a forgery, it needs to be exposed as such so that millions of people will not be misled. We will give the reasons for our skepticism as we proceed with this article. And it goes on later on page 4 of the article. Since we have been deeply involved in research having to do with the relationship of Mormonism to magic, we were delighted to the report that Martin Harris had written a letter relating to the subject. Sometime later, we were told of another letter written by W. Phelps, which seemed to prove the authenticity of the letter attributed to Harris. This letter is printed in Howe's book, pages 273 to 274. In the letter, Phelps tells of Martin Harris' statements concerning the Book of Mormon. There are some remarkable parallels between the two letters. So this makes sense, right? A letter written from W. Phelps to Martin Harris, written after the Salamander letter, contains similar themes to the Salamander letter, which is written from Harris to William Wines Phelps, to W. Phelps, right? So it goes on to describe it here. Both letters refer to the Urim and Thummim as silver spectacles. Both accounts tell of Martin Harris taking a copy of the Book of Mormon characters to Utica, Albany, and New York, and both talk of the Book of Mormon language as shorthand Egyptian. Since Phelps' letter is dated 15th of January, 1831, less than 3 months after the letter which was reported to have been written by Harris, it seemed safe to conclude that Phelps used the Harris letter in preparing his own. In all fairness, however, we made another discovery which we feel we must report. Just 2 pages after Phelps' letter, we found a statement written by E.D. Howe, which is strangely similar to the Harris letter. Now, I'll read that passage in just a second. This is the similarities found in E.D. Howe's book, the first anti-Mormon book, Mormonism Unveiled, published in 1834. We would expect that there might be similarities between the letter exchange between W. Phelps and Martin Harris, but we wouldn't expect to find verbiage that's in Mormonism Unveiled, written in 1834, to be in Martin Harris's letter that was written in 1830, right? That would be a problem. So the passage that is talking about here is from E.D. Howe's book says, "The reader will remember that the letter said, 'The Spirit transfigured himself from a white salamander in the bottom of the hole.' E.D. Howe's statement reads as follows." Now, this is Howe's statement. This is not from William Wines Phelps. This is what Howe wrote in his book, Mormonism Unveiled. Quote, "Looked into the hole where he saw a toad which immediately transformed itself into a spirit." Notice that both accounts use the word "the whole" as well as "spirit," and the words "transfigured himself" resemble "transformed itself." There we go. So that is where he saw these stark similarities between the Salamander letter and Mormonism Unveiled, and it kind of seemed really odd to see those. But there were also 6 other possible sources that the Tanners, that Gerald was able to point to and code in color coding. Please go to utlm.org, follow the links in the show notes for this, because the books and articles that it cites, there's 7 possibilities, and it has color coding of the entire Salamander letter. There's Mormonism Unveiled, that's the first one. And then we have BYU Studies, Autumn of 1976, New Witness for Christ in America by Francis Kirkham, Tiffany's Monthly Interview with Martin Harris, that makes sense, the ABC History of Palmyra and the Beginnings of Mormonism by Willard Bean, Mormonism, Magic, and Masonry by Gerald and Sandra Tanner. That's right, they found some of their own work in the Salamander letter. That seems interesting. And then Comprehensive History of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints by B.H. Roberts. So all of those 7 sources that I just listed show remarkable similarities to certain passages that are in the Salamander letter. And all of those were possibly books that Mark Hofmann would have read before he wrote this letter, before he actually constructed the Salamander letter. So that's what is so telling. That's what's so creepy about this, and why Gerald said that it shook him to his very core to see these similarities, to find that there was strong evidence for the Salamander letter being plagiarized. Gerald continues on, "That Howe's statement is so much like the one in the Harris letter is a little disturbing. Even more disconcerting, however, is the fact that it appears just 2 pages from a letter by W. Phelps, which also bears remarkable parallels. As we understand it, the church's handwriting expert, Dean Jesse, there's that Dean Jesse guy again, feels that the signature was penned by Martin Harris, but so far, no tests on the paper have been completed. We feel that the letter should be made available to other handwriting experts, and that the public should be informed where the letter was originally obtained." There you go. There's where Gerald is hitting on it. Said, okay, the church historian, the church handwriting expert has looked at this, but other people need to look at it, and we need to know the pedigree. We need to know where this came from. This is the beginning of it. This marked the beginning of when Gerald Tanner began the crusade against Hofmann, and for the purposes of exposing the truth, basically. He continues, "We have heard that there is a red postal mark on the original letter, and that the amount of postage is correct for a letter from Palmyra to Canandaigua. Although the average person would have a difficult time forging these things, there are probably a number of people who could do the job." That's important, right? People were wondering, there's no way that somebody could possibly do this. No way an average person studying Mormon history could do this. But Gerald said, that may be the case, but there are probably a number of people who could do this. And that's all that we needed. That is the one small seed of doubt that so many people needed in order to open up this line of inquiry about Hofmann's work and his forgeries. He continues, while we would really like to believe that the letter attributed to Harris is authentic, we do not feel that we can endorse it until further evidence comes forth. Now, the article continues on. We'll just read, a couple more extracts from it because it's really interesting here. But I just want to point out something. In the audio with Sandra, I said that I admire her and Gerald for their intellectual honesty when it came to the Salamander letter, right? They wanted so much for it to be authentic because it's a huge nail in the coffin for Joseph Smith being, so-called divinely inspired. The letter links Joseph directly to occult rituals. The Tanners wanted so desperately for this letter to be authentic, but they had reservations about its authenticity and therefore withheld judgment until more evidence could come forward and more people could actually examine the letter itself. I think this says a good deal about their intellectual honesty and constant pursuit of truth. They couldn't give this letter their own stamp of approval and therefore didn't report on it and sensationalize it and begin building a case using the letter as evidence like the church began doing with Oakes claiming the salamander is, just an analog for a spirit that can live in fire. I mean, I can't point this out enough. The church was in damage control mode while the Tanners were in let's find the truth mode. The church bought this letter hook, line, and sinker while the Tanners were claiming that something was fishy. And the next paragraph in the Tanner's book really goes to show the frustration that was introduced with the possibility of the Salamander letter being a forgery. As soon as I noticed that there were problems with the Salamander letter, I began to realize the serious implications this would have for the study of Mormon history. Prior to Mark Hofmann's appearance on the scene, the documents we had used in building our case against Mormonism seemed to have a good pedigree. For instance, the Joseph Smith papyri were rediscovered in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in 1967. Although officials at the museum did not acquire the papyri until 1947, they had been aware of them since 1918. The papyri could, in fact, be traced back to the Smith family. The documents which prove Joseph Smith was tried as a glass looker in 1826 could be traced back to the jail in Norwich, New York. Two men, in fact, signed affidavits that they were discovered in the basement of the jail. Joseph Smith's strange account of the first vision, as well as his diaries, could be traced directly to the church's historical department where they had been preserved. When Mark Hofmann came onto the scene, however, everything seemed to change. Hofmann was vague about where his finds were coming from, and no one seemed to think of questioning his veracity. The Deseret News for October 27, 1985 said that Hofmann's reputation regarding documents was impeccable, and his friends in the historical circle defended it. It was only after I began to have doubts about the Salamander letter that I began to realize that Hofmann was not providing pedigrees for his discoveries. There's a big problem. While Mormon scholars felt that the Bible in which Hofmann found the Anthon transcript, it was supposed to have been pasted between two pages, came from the Smith family, Hofmann refused to disclose where he had bought the book. Since book collectors sometimes have a policy of checking out every page of a rare book, I would have liked to talk to the collector to see if he remembered anything glued between the pages. With regard to the Joseph Smith III blessing, Hofmann only said that it came from a descendant of Thomas Bullock. When we pressed Hofmann to reveal which descendant, because there must be hundreds, he refused to be any help. Lucy Mack Smith's letter in 1829, Joseph Smith's 1825 letter, and Martin Harris's 1873 letter all seem to have no pedigree. In the case of the Salamander letter, I did learn that Hofmann claimed that it came from a man by the name of Lynn Jacobs. I also learned that Hofmann and Jacobs were working together in the document business. Since the documents were all coming from these two men, it was necessary to focus in upon their backgrounds. By August 1984, I was convinced that the evidence against the Salamander letter cast a real shadow of a doubt on all the important discoveries Mark Hofmann had made since 1980. On August 22nd, 1984, I printed the first part of the pamphlet, The Money Digging Letters. On page 9 of that publication, I wrote, now quoting the Money Digging Letters, quote, "A number of important documents have come to light during the 1980s. The questions raised by the Salamander letter have forced us to take a closer look at some of these documents." Now, going back to what we were reading earlier, in the same publication, I wrote the following concerning the Salamander letter. "The more we examine this letter attributed to Harris, the more questions we have about its authenticity." I went on to show important parallels between other documents and the Salamander letter. I noted that the parallels to the Joseph Knight account, first published in 1976, seemed to be extremely important. On page 7, I told of an interview with Martin Harris, which was published in 1859. The interview in Tiffany's Monthly also raises a very serious question about the lack of religious material in the Salamander letter. In the interview, this is the Tiffany's Monthly interview, Harris quoted at least 5 portions of the Bible. He used the words Revelation, Moses, Scripture, and Christ at least once. He used the word prayed twice and mentioned the devil 4 times. The word angel or angels appears 5 times. God is mentioned 7 times, and the word Lord appears 10 times. In the Salamander letter, all of these words are absent. In fact, there is nothing we can find concerning religion. Spirits are mentioned many times in the letter, but they are never linked to God in any way. Instead, they are linked to money digging. They are the guardians of the treasure. This total lack of religious material seems to be out of character for Martin Harris. A person might try to maintain that Harris was more interested in religion in 1859, but the evidence shows that he was always that way. Now, I know that I'm reading so much from this, the tracking the white salamander here, but this is what we have to do, unfortunately, because Gerald Tanner has passed. I would really love to have sat down with him as well as with Sandra and, have both of them discuss their time with Mark Hofmann and everything that was going on at the time, but unfortunately, the best that we can get from Gerald Tanner is his own first-person account of the what happened here. So that's what we're reading here, his own first-person accounts of how he came to understand that the Salamander letter was a forgery. I know I'm relying heavily on this, but there's just so much interesting information here, and he lays it out so beautifully for us to understand in a chronological format. So let me just take a second to talk about Gerald's study of Martin Harris here, right? Sandra said that this is what he did. Before the text of the Salamander letter came out, Gerald studied heavily Martin Harris's work, anything that we could find from Martin Harris, to see if he could find those similar themes in the Salamander letter. Now, to talk about Martin Harris just a little bit, last week's episode had a clip from H. Michael Marquardt where he and I discussed Martin Harris at great length. Now, Harris seemed like he was a very religiously, crazy, zealous man, right? He was always talking about God and devils and spirits and revelations, etc. But the Salamander letter, which was written a short while after Harris self-reported walking through the woods and speaking with God in the form of a deer for a while, has none of the language that we would expect out of Martin Harris. This may have been the most striking problem with the Salamander letter that was supposedly written by this religious zealot, right? It wasn't just what was in the letter that gave it away. It was also what wasn't in the letter that should have been there that gave it away, or at least, raised flags for Gerald when he was doing the research here. So continuing on with tracking the white salamander here, Gerald's first person perspective, quote, "On the following page, I charge that Mr. Hofmann had originally tried to sell the Salamander letter to the Mormon Church for a large amount of money. Hofmann later told me that it was actually Lynn Jacobs who took the letter to the church. Hofmann seemed willing, however, to admit that he was involved in the decision to sell the letter to the church. In any case, I went on to state, in the past, Mr. Hofmann acted under the theory that the church will buy up embarrassing documents to suppress them. This is very clear from his own account of how he handled the discovery of the Joseph Smith III blessing. In a paper given at the Mormon History Association, Mark Hofmann stated that he did not want to come across like I was trying to blackmail the church, but he acknowledged that if the church had wanted him to, he would have promised to never tell anyone about its discovery. That is blackmail. That's blackmail. That's what that is. Hofmann later commented, "It surprised me a bit that the church didn't buy it up quick and stash it away somewhere." That was in the Sunstone Review, September 1982. Continuing on with Gerald. However this may be, it is reported that the Mormon Church felt that Hofmann's price was too high on the Salamander letter and refused his offer. The document was later sold to Stephen Christensen. We feel that one of the most important tests of the letter's authenticity is its history, since it was written. If Mr. Hofmann will tell historians where he obtained the letter, then it may be possible to trace it back to its original source. Now, there's just one more excerpt to read out of this, but I have to just say really quickly, this is where that intellectual honesty comes in once again. Gerald was examining the source of the document, saying that if Hofmann can just tell us where he found it, it might be more believable. But instead, it looks a lot more like he's just blackmailing the church in hopes that the church will want to buy up and suppress these damaging documents. Gerald was only in pursuit of the truth, even if that came into conflict with what he personally wanted to happen, which was for the Salamander letter to be true, of course. Continuing on with Gerald, this is the last passage we're going to read out of this. The day following the publication of the money-digging letters, Mark Hofmann came to our house and had a long talk with Sandra. Now, if you remember back to the audio at the beginning of the episode, she talked a bit about this meeting. He seemed very distressed and hurt that we, of all people, would question his discoveries. He had expected that opposition might come from those in the church, but he was amazed that Utah Lighthouse Ministry had taken a position which was critical of him. Mr. Hofmann tried to explain that he could not reveal the source of the Salamander letter because he had sold it to Christensen. With regard to the Joseph Smith III blessing, Hofmann indicated that he had given the Mormon Church an affidavit which stated where he had obtained it. He could not reveal the source to the public, however, because the member of the Bullock family from whom he had purchased the document also had important papers concerning Brigham Young's finances that would be embarrassing to the church. Sandra felt that Mark Hofmann was almost to the point of tears as he pled his case as to why we should trust him. He did not make any threats, however, nor did he show any sign of being violent. At any rate, Hofmann's explanations certainly did not satisfy me. End quote. This is the best part, in my opinion. This is the point that Sandra was talking about in the audio at the beginning, where Hofmann was saying, something along the lines of, if you continue to question my work, then I won't be able to produce these Bullock letters that describe Brigham Young's finances and stuff. Sandra wanted to see this. She wanted to see what was going to come out next from Hofmann, but Gerald was already disenchanted and had Hofmann pegged as a fraud. So very soon following this meeting between Sandra and Hofmann, and after the publication that Gerald put out there, the Deseret News published an article titled Letter. This is from September 1st, 1984. There's a link for it in the show notes. It's a lot easier to find than the previous one that I read. But go check it out. Check the show notes for the actual photocopy. It's on Google News. Quote, church officials have restrained their comments about the document because it does not belong to the church. Aha. There's that degree of separation that they were working with, thanks to Stephen Christensen and Gary Sheets. Those two guys being the purchasers of the document, the church was able to say, we can't talk about it because it's not ours. So that they were really smart in doing this. It bought them some time. Though few people have viewed the original document, several have studied typewritten copies of its contents. The letter purportedly contains an account of experiences Joseph Smith had in discovering the plates that became the Book of Mormon. The letter purportedly says Joseph Smith found the plates by using a seer stone, an item treasure hunters of the era were known to use in their hunts. The purported letter is reported to say he was confronted near the plates by an old spirit that transfigured from a white salamander. But few people seem certain of the letter's authenticity. In fact, Outspoken Mormon church critics Gerald and Sandra Tanner suspect the document is a forgery, they told the Deseret News. Gerald Tanner has not seen the actual letter, but says similarities between it and other documents makes its veracity doubtful. Tanner said he studied the typescript of the document and wanted to believe it, but when he compared it to the 1834 Mormonism Unveiled by E.D. Howe, he found highly similar stories about Smith viewing a toad that turned itself into a man or a spirit. Another disturbing aspect, Tanner said, was the letter seemed out of character for Harris. In the entire text of the letter, there is no mention of religion in the sense of religion as we know it, Tanner said. So this is everything that we read out of the Tracking the White Salamander just now. And now the Deseret News, after it was published, the Deseret News is picking up on this and saying, hey, some people are questioning the Salamander letter, so maybe we should withhold judgment on it a little bit. But it continues on here. I don't know if they necessarily embraced it the way they should have. But Tanner feels the document is an extremely important find. It deserves a lot of attention, he said. If it's authentic, it's extremely important to linking Mormonism to the occult. If it's a forgery, then it's important because there's a document forger out there. End quote. I think this speaks great volumes to intellectual honesty. Proper scholarship, proper historianship hinge on people like Gerald and Sandra Tanner here. They wanted to find the truth about the letter. Instead of siding with the majority, or pretty much everybody that claimed the Salamander letter to be legitimate and damning to the Mormon history, all the Tanners wanted was truth. If the document was real, it has information that is challenging to the genesis of the Mormon Church. If it wasn't real, there's a document forger out there, and they need to be caught and have their work exposed to clear up the muddied waters of Mormon historical studies. That's amazing. Sandra and Gerald Tanner are two very important people to Mormon studies, to Mormon history, the way we can understand it. Sandra and Gerald Tanner are, how else can I say it? Beacons of truth in a sea of confusing scholarship and historical studies. They have been models of what people should emulate in true historical studies since the beginning of their foundation, since they began Utah Lighthouse Ministries. I have to thank them so much for what they've done. We would never be where we are in Mormon historical studies if not for their efforts and the massive body of research that they have created. Please take the time to go to utlm.org, look at some of their work, maybe purchase a book. I've purchased 3 or 4 books from them now because they are just incredible scholars. They have done an amazing amount of research and constructed this huge body of knowledge that Mormons and non-Mormons alike need to understand. And that being said, this has been a long episode and we're only halfway done. I'm afraid that's where we need to end today's episode. But next week, we'll bring the exciting conclusion to the Hofmann story. And the episode is probably going to be just as long as this one. Really. We've covered all of Hofmann's life from his birth to the biggest forgery that he had manufactured up to this point. That's the Salamander letter. He's manufactured and sold many documents from, simple signatures and banknotes all the way up to the Anthon transcript and then Joseph Smith III letter and now the Salamander letter. Now, just to talk about Mark Hofmann for a second here, we don't have any way of ascertaining the motives behind what he did or, understanding what his end game was. Personally, I think the evidence lends credibility to the claim that Hofmann became disenchanted with the church and wanted to catch the leadership in a gotcha moment, proving they would be willing to buy up documents that are challenging to their history for the purpose of suppressing them and hiding them from the white-hot light of public scrutiny. It does need to be pointed out, Hofmann's forgeries may have been a good thing. There's no way of completely reversing the damage that he did or of even knowing how many documents he forged throughout his 7 years of active buying, selling, and trading, right? It's really unfortunate, no doubt, and it tends to lend credibility to the argument that some people might claim that, what you read online is nothing but anti-Mormon propaganda. And if some of it out there has been just manufactured by people like Mark Hofmann, that is frustrating. And there is credibility to the argument that people make like that. But what I find so interesting about it is the fact that Hofmann eventually was called out for manufacturing documents by people in relevant fields that were studying his work in depth. It may have taken 7 years because he was obviously a master forger to get away with it for so long. But he made a couple of slips, just like any forger does, and that made a scholar like Gerald Tanner question the work, which began the landslide to discovering Hofmann as a fraud and exposing his work. Now, why I say it may have been a good thing is it caused us to question Mormon history and the sources by which we understand that history. Hofmann wasn't creating these documents out of thin air. I mean, that needs to be said. More often than not, he was only creating a document that was known to exist at one time, merely filling in the gap where that document would have existed when it was created, and, that no longer exists today. I mean, take, for example, the document that Hofmann offered to sweeten the deal with the Salamander letter, right? The 2-for-1, basically. Hofmann claimed that he had an 1825 contract signed by Josiah Stowell and Joseph Smith Sr., saying that they would evenly split the proceeds of the treasure they were hunting for in Pennsylvania. We know that this treasure hunt occurred from contemporary sources. We also know that Joseph Smith was essentially convicted as a glass looker for playing a con on Josiah Stowell, convincing Stowell to pay for the trip and fund the treasure digging for a few weeks. We didn't know if there was a contract signed between these men, but we do know that that treasure hunting trip did happen. In forging the contract, Hofmann wasn't just making something up out of thin air. He knew that a contract may have existed at one point and forged that contract to fit into the existing historical narrative. The same thing can be said about the Salamander letter. Harris believed that Joseph Smith had magical powers, granted by God, second sight, and could see anything he desired through Joseph Stone and hat parlor trick, right? That's how Martin Harris and Joseph Smith really began their working dynamic. In E.D. Howe's book, we have a person with a signed affidavit saying that there was a toad guardian in the hole guarding the plates, not a salamander specifically, but a toad. And it struck Joseph 3 times when he tried to pick up the plates. Now, a letter like this from Martin Harris to William Wines Phelps may have existed at one point, with the detail of white salamander changed to toad, of course. But we don't have any reason to believe that a letter like this still exists today. The point is, Hofmann didn't just manufacture the salamander letter out of thin air. He forged something that may have existed at one point and fit in the existing narrative of Mormon history that was already well substantiated. In my honest opinion, naked opinion you may call it, Hofmann doing what he did has served to help the field of Mormon historical study in ways that we can't even imagine or quantify. He caused so many scholars and historians to question from where they learned their Mormon history and recheck the trustworthiness and pedigree of existing documents. He introduced skepticism into the field of Mormon history. There may have been a problem with Mormon historians trusting people too easily before Hofmann came along, and Hofmann merely exposed that weakness in the field of Mormon studies. His work served to bolster the body of knowledge that has been built up around Mormon scholarship and historical studies, not tear it down. This may sound odd, but I'm almost glad that Hofmann did what he did. It seems that he initially set out on a mission to expose the fact that the church suppresses information. Whether they're historical documents or how much money they're paying for those documents, the church was acting as the shady character in these deals, and Hofmann must have known they would do that, or he wouldn't have embarked on such a journey in the first place. he was smart enough to pull underhanded tricks to drive up the price by increasing public awareness and then manufacturing this new commodity system with values that he arbitrarily chose based on the public outcry. But I think he had a noble goal in doing so, at least to start. Now, Hofmann did say in a later interview that he was in it for the money, and I'll try to find that exact quote for part 2 of this clean-cut Mark Hofmann episode. But initially, I think that Hofmann was angry at the church in the same way and for the same reasons that many believers are angry with the church when they first learn about the real history and understand how much the church has obfuscated it. I do think that Hofmann lacked a fair amount of empathy. That was a big problem. When we look at the post-trial interview he did and, read his answers to some very harsh questions like why did he kill people, he seemed to lack any remorse for the people that he killed in the bombings or for the remaining family members that were left in the aftermath. I mean, that's a bit of a problem, that lack of, connection and empathy. The people that purchased the Salamander letter, Stephen Christensen and Gary Sheets, become the targets of Hofmann in mid-October 1985, a year and a half after the point that we got up to in this episode, March 1984. As we heard in the interview with Sandra that opened this episode, Hofmann killed 2 people with mercury switch pipe bombs, and 1 day later nearly killed himself when a 3rd bomb exploded in his own car. We have pictures of his MR2 that just looks like it's a can that got peeled open. It's crazy. You can find them online. I'll leave a link in next week's episode to the picture of his exploded car because it's just crazy to look at. But that's it for this episode, though. That's all we can really talk about. This has been huge. I mean, we have a bit to cover in the next episode. There's so much more time, so many more deals to talk about. I hope you stick around for part 2 of this clean-cut examination of Mark Hofmann. He's really a fascinating individual. And this history that we're talking about right now, the vast majority of the people involved are still alive and are still active in studying church history, like Sandra Tanner. This is important history that's still in living color in front of us today. It happened only 30 years ago, less than a generation. Mark Hofmann is still in the Utah State Penitentiary in Draper, Utah, right now. As for our examination, Hofmann still has many deals to make and many forgeries to manufacture before he dabbles into manufacturing bombs. So be sure to catch next week's episode to hear the conclusion of Mark Hofmann's story. But before calling it good tonight, need to thank a few people. First off, I'd like to thank Demonista for running the Facebook page. She posts up great stuff on there. Be sure to search Naked Mormonism on Facebook and like the page. We're so close to 1,000 likes. Also need to thank Jason Camo for providing the music that's used in this show with his permission. For more of his music, you can go to aloststateofmind.com. Also need to thank Craig Keeling for producing the artwork that's used for this show as well as the daughter podcast. For his blog, you can go to weirdmormonshit.com. And I'd like to thank all of the patrons who support the show on patreon.com/nakedmormonism that keep this a full-time endeavor. Thank you so much. It's very deeply appreciated. If you'd like to call in and leave a voicemail, call in at 864-NAKED-MO or 864-625-3366 and leave a voicemail talking about the show, past episodes, or even your story. I'd like to thank most of all you lovely listeners for lending me your ear. I hope to talk to you next time here on the Naked Mormonism Podcast.